What does it mean to be free from fear? To be able to stare down adversity and face it with confidence. It's often said that hardship builds character. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is remembered today as a titan of American history, but for most of his life, he was just another politician, completely unremarkable. It was the 32nd president's greatest personal crisis that would transform him both as a person and as a politician. The most important day of FDR's life wasn't Pearl Harbor or when he won the presidency, it was the day that he learned he had polio. This devastating diagnosis that took the use of his legs and threatened to completely derail his life would serve as a necessary crucible on the path to realizing his full potential. The next few years would be defined by trial and error, where Roosevelt exhibited an incredible resolve to face his crisis head-on and come out as a better version of himself. It's during his 7-year political exile that FDR truly found himself as a leader. This isn't going to be a video about all of FDR's policies or all the good and bad that he did while president, but instead a character study about the man and his leadership style. FDR's presidency has been covered extensively, so instead, let's take a look at the years before he was president and how he achieved the freedom from fear he would hope to pass on to the American people. Franklin Roosevelt started his political career with a short stint in the New York State Senate before becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson. Despite being loyal to Wilson during his tenure, the truth is the only politician the young Roosevelt was completely devoted to was himself. In college, he idolized his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, and sought to emulate him. Franklin would go as far as to roughly follow the same career path as the elder Roosevelt: state politician, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Governor of New York, and eventually President of the United States. During his early political career, Franklin was best known for being charismatic at dinner parties instead of any remarkable policy achievements. Despite molding himself in Theodore's image, Franklin had few instances of heroism or political courage, no San Juan Hill moment that allowed him to grab the nation's attention. He may have had anti-Tammany rhetoric in the state Senate, but there was no progressive legislation to back it up. As president, Roosevelt sought to renew not just the country's economy, but also its spirit. He advocated to replace the self-interest of the 1920s with a patriotic generosity. Polio destroyed FDR's sense of certainty and taught him how to find hope in darkness, turning him into the gifted politician that's written in the history books. The American people believed in Roosevelt's promise for a hopeful future because he believed in it himself. While the public didn't know the true extent of Roosevelt's polio, they knew enough to see that he had overcome great hardship. FDR may have been successful before polio, but he was far from great. Politicians constantly talk about hope. It's said so often that we forget what it actually means. The best work I've read about Franklin D. Roosevelt is Becoming FDR by Jonathan Darman. I think it does a fantastic job at exploring the facets of FDR's personality that I want to examine in this video. A question framed by Darman that really stuck with me is, when our leaders talk about hope, when was a moment in their lives where they really needed hope? When did they face hardship that required effort and imagination to overcome? The answer to that question can tell you a lot about a person and their leadership qualities. As a young man, FDR had displayed a great charisma and friendly demeanor, qualities that stemmed from a deep-seated need to be liked and praised. A need that may have been what drove FDR to politics in the first place.
Franklin D. Roosevelt at the threshold of a new career. He began to take a prominent place in councils of his party. His keen-minded and progressive thought were eagerly sought on state and national affairs.
To better understand these aspects of Roosevelt's character, let's examine his upbringing and how his early years shaped the man that he would become. Franklin's father, James, was a much older man who had already been married and raised a child to adulthood before being widowed at 48 years old. He would soon marry Sarah Delano, who was 26 years his junior and even a few months younger than his oldest son. Born into an aristocratic family in Hyde Park, New York, Franklin Roosevelt grew up coddled and carefree. In this patrician environment, the most important thing was to always be pleasant, and the young Roosevelt took that to heart. The condition that he needed to be pleasant created Franklin's personal agreeableness and allowed him to develop incredible emotional intuition. As a small boy, Franklin learned to read people. a tool that would be essential to his political success. Sarah Roosevelt, like many ambitious women of her era, focused her ambition on her son. Franklin was rarely exposed to other children during his youth, a lonely upbringing that would only reinforce his need to please others. James Roosevelt cherished this second chance at fatherhood and would entertain FDR's various passions, including taking the young boy sailing at Campobello, the same place his life would be forever changed by polio a few decades later. Roosevelt's father was a true aristocrat, but something about him was different. He had this profound Christian sense of duty to the poor and downtrodden that shaped much of his later life, a duty he would talk about constantly and pass on to his son. When James Roosevelt's health began to decline, Franklin learned to conceal the emotions surrounding his father's illness, something that would only further contribute to his loneliness. He was tormented at boarding school and insignificant in college because his New York upper-class status held little weight with this group of Boston socialites. Teddy Roosevelt's rise to the presidency changed Franklin's social standing and offered a taste of politics to this young people-pleaser in need of praise. Franklin Roosevelt needed love, and as a child, he was given it in abundance. This is in stark contrast to his fifth cousin and soon-to-be bride. Eleanor Roosevelt lost her mother when she was 7 years old. Her father, Elliot, younger brother of Theodore Roosevelt, was a manic depressive and alcoholic who was in and out of her life. Eleanor adored her father, who would fill her head with empty promises that he was going to come back for her so they could build their fairy tale life together. A promise that would be broken again and again until he jumped out of a window when Eleanor was just 9 years old. Because of the constant tragedy that defined Eleanor's early life, she saw love as fleeting and rare, the opposite of Franklin, who had been doted on constantly. Theodore Roosevelt would step in as a surrogate father to his young niece, developing a closeness with her that would make her a more appealing match for her husband later on. The young couple even scheduled their wedding for when Teddy, the sitting president of the United States at the time, would be in town. Despite the affection he had for Theodore, FDR was a Democrat through and through and supported Wilson over his fellow Roosevelt in the 1912 election. After his victory, President Wilson offered the young Roosevelt Teddy's old job at the Navy Department. FDR really leaned into Teddy Roosevelt's persona. He would casually say bully and drop some common references to cousin Theodore. Franklin was a Democratic reincarnation of Teddy Roosevelt, and reporters loved it. During his time at the Navy Department, Roosevelt would learn valuable lessons that aided him during his presidency, such as how to work with Congress and manage big government projects. What he didn't gain, however, watching the First World War unfold comfortably from his Navy Department desk, were the lessons men learn in war. The visceral hardship that comes from it, the crisis and the struggle that Roosevelt would have to learn to overcome at a later date.
When the Democrats gathered in San Francisco in July 1920 for their national convention, Roosevelt's name was on many tongues. It was inevitable that he should be nominated for vice president to run with James M. Cox.
In 1920, FDR would be the Democratic nominee for the vice presidency. By all accounts, Roosevelt didn't really believe that they could win. He was actively making plans for work and vacation following the election, which is never a good sign.
Campaigning had to go on, even though he felt the cause was lost. In speech after speech, with the extraordinary energy which is even now the amazement of the nation, he sought to rally the discouraged democracy.
The Cox and Roosevelt ticket lost in a landslide, even losing Roosevelt's home state of New York. Following his landslide defeat in the 1920 election, Franklin would be without a government job for the first time since entering the state senate back in 1911. He was prepared to coast on his name and connections by working in the private sector back in New York City, but destiny had other plans. The newest stage of his life was about to begin. FDR was 39 years old when he contracted polio, but he would undergo a metamorphosis so great that his political rivals who had known him previously would now underestimate him at every turn. Polio was then known as infantile paralysis, as it most often affected children. In 1920, the Roosevelts had been quite concerned with the disease following an outbreak in New York City where they lived, but only in regards to their kids, not themselves. Franklin even sent a letter to Eleanor, who was away at Campobello with the children, that read, "The infantile paralysis in NY and vicinity is appalling. Please kill all the flies. I think it really important." That same year, he even managed to borrow the Secretary of the Navy's official yacht to bring the children to Hyde Park from Campobello in order to avoid the disease on the train. In reality, Franklin, who had an isolated rural boyhood, likely had much lower immunity to the disease than his children who grew up in New York and DC. On July 27, 1921, FDR was visiting a Boy Scout camp in Bear Mountain, New York. It was likely here, through a body of still water, in a moment so seemingly insignificant, that Franklin Roosevelt's life and American history in consequence would be forever changed. Franklin felt increasingly sick for weeks, but he still managed to join his family at their summer home on the island of Campobello, Maine. After a day of rigorous physical activity, including hours of putting out a forest fire on a nearby island, he was extremely exhausted, feeling weak and feverish. But most concerning of all, he was unable to move his body. He screamed in agony, sharp pains in his bones. His skin grew so tender that the soft blanket that was coated on him felt as if it was stabbing his skin. This man of great ego and self-importance had gotten to the point where he couldn't control his bladder or bowels. Campobello was one of the worst places Roosevelt could have fallen ill. Far from any hospital, they relied on the local doctor on the island for Franklin's care. He misdiagnosed the ailing Roosevelt with a blood clot and prescribed vigorous massage, a treatment that can actually worsen muscle decay in polio patients. It wasn't until a few doctors from the mainland were able to get on the island that the proper diagnosis was finally reached: infantile paralysis. No matter what happened in Franklin's life, he played to the audience. Just as he had hid any discomfort from his childhood, his unhappiness at boarding school, the grief he felt around the loss of his father, FDR would now hide any sign of despair at his new diagnosis. Franklin and Eleanor's children, who had known their father to always be playful and energetic, would have been panicked to see him at his current state. But even as Franklin was carried off the island on a makeshift stretcher, he flashed his trademark smile on the onlooking children as not to worry them. Eleanor Roosevelt would go through her own metamorphosis during this time. 3 years earlier, in 1918, Eleanor had discovered an affair between Franklin and her former secretary, Lucy Mercer. She was devastated by this discovery and even offered her husband a divorce, which was virtually unheard of at that time. Discovering the affair was painful, but it transformed her and allowed her to forge her own identity for the first time in her life. She wasn't going to believe in fairy tale futures anymore. Not from her father, not from Franklin, not from anyone. FDR chose not to seek a divorce, but this did little to rekindle their relationship. Eleanor knew he didn't choose her, he chose politics. Franklin wanted elected office, and divorce would have killed his chances. Though they remained married, their relationship was never really one of romance after that revelation. Eleanor would soon find her own path in politics, starting her own career and being increasingly sought after for her opinions during her husband's political exile. A story that certainly deserves a video of its own. Despite being considerably wealthy, Roosevelt would use a dining chair he converted into a wheelchair for the rest of his life. You can actually see back here a little bobblehead that I have of him sitting in that chair. Which brings me to this video sponsor, Bobbletopia. Bobbletopia is a great company who I have been a big fan of even before they started sponsoring the videos. My personal favorite is this FDR bobblehead that I just mentioned. I've had it for quite a long time and it's always been a little part of my backdrop that I think is a lot of fun. It's awesome to be able to see the distinctive personality of these characters through the bobbleheads, and I think they make for great decoration anywhere that you would want to put them. You can find bobbleheads of a bunch of other presidents or even your favorite fictional characters available on the website right now. You can use code andredutratv at checkout for 10% off your bobblehead of choice, and make sure to comment down below which bobblehead that you get. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. FDR was one of the great speakers of human history, but I wanted to read his most famous speech aloud to really emphasize the words being delivered here and how they reflect upon Roosevelt's darkest moment. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured. will revive, and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. This entire paragraph reflects so clearly his battle with polio, requiring the truth from his doctor, honestly facing the conditions of his paralysis, reviving his sense of strength, and prospering like never before, overcoming the fear, the nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which could paralyze not just his body, but the needed efforts to convert retreat into advance, convert illness into greatness. FDR's close advisor, Lewis Howe, had planned out Franklin's entire political life, and polio had thrown a wrench in that plan. But luckily, Lewis was there that day on Campobello, beside FDR as he had always been, ready to harness FDR's will to recover, ready to build a new plan. Here, FDR would develop his talent for reading others even further. He came to have the subtle human understanding where he could detect slight hesitation or lack of emphasis in a phrase. It was at this moment that Lewis Howe would create the plan for the presidency, and at this moment that he would tell FDR that his disability is what would make him president. Roosevelt would have to learn patience. He would have to learn to wait and not chase every opportunity. Franklin had run for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senator from New York back in 1914, contrary to Howe's recommendation, and gotten absolutely trounced. The new Roosevelt would learn to resist those urges. FDR's early career was characterized by constant activity, which prevented deep thought and self-reflection. He always acted before thinking. Now he was bedridden with nothing to do but think and study the issues. He became deeply acquainted with all kinds of public policy he would have never dreamed of learning beforehand. One of my favorite quotes in regards to FDR came from Lewis Howe, who said, "A year or two in bed should be prescribed to all our statesmen." In his newfound self-reflection, he began to think of other vulnerable people like the poor and misfortunate. Roosevelt always claimed that his choice of a political career was the choice of service, but in reality it had only ever served himself. Warm Springs was the first time he truly helped the public. To do good, you yourself must first become great. The Springs may not have brought FDR's legs back, but what they did bring was an understanding of others' pain and how to heal that pain. Former New York Governor Al Smith was the Democratic nominee for the presidency in 1928, and he needed to win his home state if he wanted a shot at the nation's highest office. Smith was strong in New York City, but needed a solid upstate candidate to run for governor and turn out the Democratic vote, and Roosevelt was the perfect man for the job. Roosevelt had resisted calls for his candidacy, releasing statements saying he still needed to focus on his recovery. Statements that created the image of a man setting aside his personal interests to answer a call of duty, reluctantly sacrificing his health and well-being for the good of his party. At this point in his life, Franklin still believed he'd be able to walk again, but with the perfect path back into the world of politics laid out in front of him, he had to make a decision between further recovery and a return to public life. And I think you know what he chose. The Franklin Roosevelt that emerged from his exile was a different man. His sharp features had been softened by wrinkles well beyond his years. Polio had aged him significantly and nearly killed his dreams of the presidency, and yet his large chest and heavy muscular arms defined his physical frame. These 7 years away from politics devoted to rehabilitation had also been devoted to a detailed plan of return, a return that would bring the most significant American presidency since Abraham Lincoln. During Roosevelt's political exile, radio took hold of American life, an evolution that paralleled Franklin's own and would provide him with a platform to put his best asset on full display.
For the first time in 5 long years, the relief rolls have declined instead of increased during the winter months.
FDR became a master storyteller, one who could turn complex problems and public policy into sweeping drama. Before, he saw giving speeches as a physical act of performance and shaking hands strongly afterward. Now he really needed to focus on his words and actually listen to how his audience was reacting. During his time away, he developed a sense that the government shouldn't just alleviate need, but also create confidence in its citizens. Polio had brought Roosevelt down to earth while simultaneously making him the great man he had always set out to be.
But events were moving fast. Al Smith, as candidate for president in 1928, wanted a good man to run for governor of New York. He persuaded Franklin Roosevelt to make the race. And although Mr. Smith lost the state by a narrow vote, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to his first term as governor.
FDR would win the governorship by a margin of just 26,000 votes out of 4.3 million votes cast. Even with a narrow victory, the exile was officially over. Taking the oath of office required putting one hand in the air and one hand on the Bible. He pressed the entire weight of his body on that one hand, trying hard to hold himself up, shaking in the process, yet his voice remained strong. While FDR's doctors might have given him overly optimistic prospects for his recovery, they were always honest about the state of his current condition. Even if it didn't succeed, it forced him to be decisive and to commit to long-term plans of recovery without instant results or gratification. This is a very difficult thing to achieve. This sort of optimism can be quite toxic because it allows you to not fully admit the severity of a problem. Think about Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech, where he touches on the same themes of reviving the American spirit, or him asking Americans to lower their heaters and wear sweaters indoors during the energy crisis. FDR had a peculiar ability for striking that balance, both because of his natural talents as a politician and his new life experience with polio. FDR's patrician background is a reminder of just how far from the common man he really was. Deep divisions between the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party had weakened their chances at electing a president. The extensive amount of time that Roosevelt spent in Warm Springs, Georgia made him a much more palatable candidate to Southern Democrats who would have otherwise been suspicious of a New York politician. Eleanor was disturbed by the heavily segregated area and its mistreatment of its black inhabitants, something that her husband never took issue with even after his newfound empathy for the downtrodden. This contradiction in FDR's character is best reflected in his reprehensible placement of Japanese American citizens in internment camps during the Second World War, an act that many people consider to be the worst of his presidency.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
In the chaos surrounding World War II, how did one reporter gain the interest of John F. Kennedy, Adolf Hitler, and J. Edgar Hoover? A writer, actress, and accused spy, the story of Inga Arvad is one that isn't often taught in the history books. Nonetheless, it is an important one in trying to understand how small the world can be even during periods of great change. This fascinating woman caught the eye of some of the most important people of the 20th century, and how she did it provides valuable insight into their personalities and character.
The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world. Through its leadership can come a more vital life for all of our people.
Before his presidency, before the assassination, before he was elevated to a cultural icon that would define the American century, John F. Kennedy was just a man in love.
That means a date. Not like just going around with the crowd. Just me and the girl.
This skinny kid from a wealthy family was still just a seed of the man who would become president. Jack Kennedy was taught to be a womanizer from a very young age. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, engaged in numerous extramarital affairs and encouraged his sons to do the same.
Ambassador Joseph Kennedy has been joined by part of his family. Mrs. Kennedy has come from the United States with 5 of their 9 children. These are cameramen, not more children.
Early letters between a young JFK and his friends show that he had always been quite popular with the opposite sex, even if he likely embellished it at first. As a man of his era, JFK had a very misogynistic attitude towards women and saw them as objects to be conquered. Needless to say, this is a very outdated and problematic worldview, but it's an important piece of the puzzle when studying the Arvad affair. Kennedy's numerous affairs are well documented, from Hollywood starlet Marilyn Monroe to mob wife Judith Campbell. But there's one affair that stands above the rest, the woman who may have been the great love of Kennedy's life, who he would never be allowed to marry.
The Kennedys were married last month. They're still looking for a place to live in Washington.
Inga Arvad was born on October 6, 1913 in Copenhagen, Denmark. During her early life, her family would move around between England, Paris, and Brussels. By all accounts, Arvad is described as a beautiful, radiant woman with the intelligence and charm to back it up. She was crowned Miss Denmark in 1931 at just 16 years old and even competed in the Miss Europe pageant. The following year, she would get married to an Egyptian diplomat by the name of Kamal Abdel Nabi, though they would be divorced just 2 years later. In 1935, Inga married a Hungarian film director named Paul Fajos, and even went on to appear in a few of his films. When acting didn't work out, Arvad moved on to journalism, becoming a correspondent for Denmark's largest newspaper, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce. The couple would travel the world together, visiting China and Southeast Asia before permanently relocating to the United States in February of 1940. By June of 1941, Miss Arvad had graduated from Columbia University's School of Journalism and moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the isolationist newspaper, the Washington Times-Herald. It's here that Inga would have her introduction to the Kennedy family through Jack's younger sister Kathleen, who often went by the nickname Kick. Out of the 9 Kennedy siblings, Jack always had a special closeness with his sister. It mattered a lot to him whether or not she approved of his romantic partners, and she would often set him up with her friends. Inga and Kick became close while working at the paper, and it didn't take long for Kick to realize her new friend was the perfect match for her brother. But the question is, who was her brother?
Senator Kennedy, could I ask you a few questions?
Oh, yes, surely, girls. You'll excuse me?
John F. Kennedy may have been a future president, but that wasn't clear to anybody at the time, especially Kennedy himself. At this point in his life, the young JFK was still deciding between pursuing a career as a journalist, intellectual, or politician. When we talk about historical figures, our first instinct is to imagine them as we know them best, at the height of their power and influence. This sort of thinking dehumanizes historical figures and creates an unnecessary separation between us and them.
Bye, Rosie. Come on, Dad. What? That's enough.
For the sake of this video, I ask that you set aside your image of JFK as the leader of the free world and instead think of him as just Jack, the rich man's son and recent Harvard graduate with a love for history, politics, and womanizing. Nothing in history has ever been preordained, so come along with me for a few minutes as we try to forget how this story ends.
John Kennedy, on the other hand, was quite a shy person, really. It was not easy for him to get out and shake hands and the rest. He did it very well. It wasn't easy for him. He was a quite private person.
It's important to understand why Kennedy and Arvad were so drawn to each other in the first place. The pair shared not only an interest in international affairs, but also on-the-ground experience in countless countries across the globe. As a child, JFK had been an avid reader with a fascination for history and government. He struggled with various health problems that would see him be constantly hospitalized throughout his youth, which only gave him more time to read. Kennedy was able to explore his interests further when his father was appointed British ambassador by Franklin Roosevelt. Not only did this give Jack a first-hand look at diplomacy in action, it gave him the permission to see the world in a way that almost no one else could. In 1937, this energetic college student was able to spend a summer driving across the European continent just before it fell under the curtain of war. His father's political connections even allowed Kennedy to be one of the last Americans to enter Nazi Germany without guns and ammunition. For a young person passionate about international affairs, this had been everything. The Kennedy who returned to Harvard after that trip was a different man from the one who left. Everyone was debating isolationism versus war, but Kennedy was the only one who saw the situation firsthand. Fast forward a few years, and the recently graduated Kennedy is now working in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. This is where our two lovers finally cross paths. Also living in DC at the time was Kick Kennedy and her friend Inga. Here's this beautiful, intelligent young woman who doesn't just match JFK's knowledge of foreign affairs, in a lot of ways she actually surpasses it. Inga was worldly, clever, and beautiful. Soon, her and Jack fell in love and started a very intense romance. During their time together, the young JFK would refer to her affectionately as Inga Binga.
Break it up, soldier. Furlough's over. And sister, don't be downhearted. My guess is he'll be back for more GI fun the very first chance he gets.
In a letter to Kick, Inga wrote,
"Tell young Kennedy that I got his letter, that it was the longest he ever wrote, that I'm saving it for my great-grandchildren, whom I hope will look like him, to see what a man he is. Tell him I smiled many times over all his political views, that he hasn't changed a bit, and I hope to God he never will.
The Kennedy family, of course, did not approve of the relationship. Inga was 5 years older than Jack, and she had already been married twice. As a womanizer himself, Joe Kennedy thought that Inga was suitable for a casual relationship, but eventually he became concerned by how serious it was getting. While Jack had dated countless women in his life, the intensity of the Arvad affair was a first. Inga had been married twice, and Jack was a Catholic considering a future in elected office. Any further pursuit of a life with Arvad would mean going against his family, his faith, and his potential career. But was there something else that made Inga particularly dangerous, even warranting an entire FBI investigation into her? This is the part of the video that you all came to see.
You may think you can trust the person you're talking to. A close relation, a lifelong friend, but you never know whether he or she will pass it on.
Earlier in the video, I mentioned Inga's work with a Danish newspaper. What I didn't mention, however, was the kind of reporting that Miss Arvad was doing. During her time with the paper, Inga visited Germany on multiple occasions to interview high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, including even Adolf Hitler himself. These weren't political interviews, they were puff pieces that talked about things like their favorite foods and their daily activities. In hindsight, this sounds insane. Imagine asking Adolf Hitler about his favorite food. Arvad lived up to her reputation as a charmer, with Hitler describing her as the perfect Nordic beauty. He was so captivated by her that he even invited her to his private box at the 1936 Olympics, where this photo was taken, a picture that would go on to haunt Arvad in the coming years. So it goes without saying, this is a bad look.
The problem now is future peace. That is your job in Germany.
It's important to note that Inga only ever wrote society pieces about Hitler and that she never endorses politics in any way, shape, or form. Regardless, it's very uncomfortable to hear someone say such kind words about Hitler. As human beings, we tend to apply significant hindsight to the past when the course of history was far from certain. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is infamous today for his failed appeasement policy towards Hitler and the Nazis, which failed to prevent the Second World War. Take a look at this newsreel from 1938 covering Chamberlain's second state visit to Nazi Germany.
So we still say honor to Mr. Chamberlain through all the doubts and aspersions of these latter days. The man who stands firm for peace deserves the trust and support of his countrymen.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
When Mr. Chamberlain left on his journey to Göteborg, he flew in the face of criticism that he was truckling to Hitler. That is one of those charges which there is no opportunity of answering until the full sequel is known. Hitler, of course, is the idol of his country. He it is who has restored Germany's power and pride. But in millions of German hearts, Mr. Chamberlain represents the man who wants to preserve peace. And not all the propaganda in the world can disguise that fact.
The way that they're talking is surreal from a modern perspective, but that's why it's so important to pay attention to. Joe Kennedy Sr., as British ambassador, was a very close ally to Chamberlain and a huge supporter of the appeasement policy, the issue that would become the political downfall of both men. Adolf Hitler was a monster, and if you're denying that, you're simply denying history. His name has become synonymous with evil, and for good reason. And while Miss Arvad's comments are certainly alarming, they attest to the fact that history happens in real time. These are human beings we're talking about, not forces of nature. The fact that so many people beyond just Inga Arvad fell under Hitler's spell is an uncomfortable truth, but it's still the truth regardless.
Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Briefcase, revolver, and coveted badge.
You might think that with the war officially underway, JFK might try to distance himself from Inga to save face, but you would be wrong. Soon, her phone was tapped and her apartment was bugged. During their surveillance of Miss Arvad, the FBI quickly discovered an affair between Inga Arvad and a skinny young man known only as Jack. As we all know, this would turn out to be no other than John F. Kennedy. It's very well possible that old Joe Kennedy had a role in Jack's transfer, as the patriarch grew concerned about how the relationship might affect the family's political prospects. The elder Kennedy put his foot down and told Jack to break it off, but Jack didn't listen. JFK soon found himself transferred to a naval base in Charleston, South Carolina, though him and Inga would still see each other as often as they possibly could. During this time, the FBI would regularly listen in on the couple being intimate with each other. This is the part of the video where I have to note the ridiculousness of the FBI listening to a future president fooling around with his suspected Nazi girlfriend. It must have been pretty awkward when JFK became president and Hoover was still the director of the FBI. This period also features numerous conversations where Inga expresses her desire to leave her husband and marry Jack, but Jack remains aloof and non-committal.
I'd like to ask you how in the world we ever got ourselves into this mess.
This is where the couple ultimately decides to break up, but not without going back and forth on the decision in the coming weeks. Inga had been estranged from her second husband, and he was even aware of the affair between her and Kennedy. We actually have access to a transcript of a conversation between Jack and Inga about her upcoming divorce thanks to the people over at the FBI.
I know that I will never go back to him.
I just wanted to be sure that this is what you want to do. From what you said, I didn't have anything to do with you getting the divorce.
You pushed the last stone under my foot, but that doesn't hold you responsible for anything. Meeting you 2.5 months ago was the chief thing that made up my mind. As far as I'm concerned, you don't exist anymore. That's how I felt an hour ago. I still love you as much as always and always will, but you don't figure in my plans whatsoever.
Okay.
You know what I mean.
Yes. As the romance started to die down, Jack found himself transferred to the Pacific Theater of the war. He wrote a very personal letter to Inga Arvad where he ponders the war he finds himself engaged in and its consequences on the men fighting in it. I thought it would be appropriate to read small portions of the letter here to provide insight into the relationship and Kennedy's experience in the war. In the letter, JFK refers to the Japanese by a slur that I don't feel comfortable repeating, which I will be replacing with simply the word Japanese, though the word will still appear on screen to preserve the original language and all of its faults and prejudice. Dear Binga, the war goes slowly here, slower than you can ever imagine from reading the papers at home. The war is a dirty business. It's very easy to talk about the war and beating the Japanese if it takes years and 1 million men, but anyone who talks like that should consider well his words. We get so used to talking about billions of dollars and millions of soldiers that thousands of casualties sound like drops in the bucket. But if those thousands want to live as much as the 10 I saw, the people deciding the whys and wherefores had better make mighty sure that all this effort is headed for some definite goal, and that when we reach that goal, we may say it was worth it. For if it isn't, the whole thing will turn to ashes, and we will face great trouble in the years to come after the war. Inga Binga, I'll be glad to see you again. I'm tired now. We were riding every night and the sleeping is tough in the daytime, but I've been told they are sending some of us home to form a new squadron in a couple of months. I've had a great time here, everything considered, but I'll be just as glad to get away from it for a while. I used to have the feeling that no matter what happened, I'd get through. It's a funny thing that as long as you have that feeling, you seem to get through. I've lost that feeling lately, but as a matter of fact, I don't feel badly about it. If anything happens to me, I have this knowledge that if I had lived to be 100, I could only have improved the quantity of my life, not the quality. This sounds gloomy as hell, I'll cut it. You are the only person I'm saying it to. As a matter of fact, knowing you has been the brightest point in an already bright 26 years. This letter points to Jack Kennedy's unique insight and thoughtfulness about world events and how powerful that can be when combined with first-hand experience. Him and Inga may have shared a unique insight into international affairs prior to the outbreak of war, but now Jack had lived through the war firsthand in a way that many men of his status wouldn't. John F. Kennedy may have sought to rekindle their romance after the war, but Inga's life had moved on. She had moved to Los Angeles and started a new life as a gossip columnist. At this point, the FBI investigation had found no evidence of any wrongdoing on Arvad's part, and they officially ended their surveillance of her. In a letter dated November 10th, 1943, Inga wrote to Jack,
"You are right here with me. Unfortunately not in person. But the other day, my things arrived from New York, and grinning at me was the first thing I saw. An old picture of you, which we use in my Washington column. I counted the teeth. There were so many, and I am sunk when I look at it too long. I don't know quite what to write you, Jack dear, because if I follow my heart as an old poet, it will be a love letter, and if I don't, it will be stiff. But you know me. I know you will be home soon. And you do know, on pins and needles, that you are the person in this world I would rather see than anybody. Or is that a little bit too much of an admission? Anyway, I don't think this letter will reach you, so I fill it up with a lot of stuff. Just this home soon, darling, and all my love."
Inga would eventually marry American actor Tim McCoy, with whom she started a family and lived out the rest of her life. As for JFK, I think you know how that story ends. I know this video has been pretty scandalous, but I want to emphasize the human element of it. The real people that make up our history, knowing they're not so different from us after all. Presidents are often regarded as great men, but what does great even mean? Does that speak to their moral virtue, their ability to lead the nation, their historical significance? For Lyndon Johnson, greatness meant power. More specifically, power over your fellow man. The kind of unique, all-encompassing power that few human beings could handle. Not only could Johnson handle this power, he chased it, he worked for it, he needed it. Presidents are ambitious by nature. My sister just gave me this wonderful Swiss lemonade. Presidents are ambitious by nature, but Lyndon Johnson might be the most ambitious of all of them. Johnson's ambition would, of course, succeed in bringing him that immense power that he so desperately craved. Power that Johnson used to pass civil rights legislation and his Great Society programs. The same power that Johnson would use to send 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam.
There's no question in my mind that in this century, the three greatest politicians, active politicians, were Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. Nobody else of the presidents was in their league as political operators.
LBJ is a deeply flawed liar, cheater, abuser, and election stealer. Yet he is still enormously complex and infinitely interesting. Greater minds than my own have tackled Johnson and created some amazing work. Robert Caro has an incredible series of books whose detailed portrait of the 36th president is longer than the Christian Bible without even being completed yet. Without Caro's work, this video wouldn't be possible, and I recommend that anyone who is interested in this subject check them out because they really are fantastic.
And as Robert Caro so poetically pointed out in his book, he knew what the presidency was for.
This is the only one that I own a physical copy of, but it's not the one we're going to be discussing in this particular video.
Maybe we can get through LBJ in that period.
Oh yes, I can do that.
Okay.
You know, there's this terrible book out on him, this Caro book.
Oh, I know it, by George Reedy. Did you read, is it Reedy's book?
No,
this new Caro book. Yeah.
It gets a rave review from Clifford Fadiman in Book of the Month. Unbelievable.
Stand by.
Shit, it makes him feel like a goddamn animal.
Quiet.
Of course he was.
The events described in this video are only a small part of the series' first book, Path to Power. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video, it really does help out. Also, let me know in the comments below what other president would you like to see explored in this fashion. I've been making my way through the behemoth that is the Caro series, but I would love to learn about other presidents when I'm done. Some would say that power corrupts, but Robert Caro argues that power reveals. Few men understood power like Lyndon Johnson. As president, LBJ was able to pass through civil rights and healthcare legislation that would have been impossible before he took office. What was it about Johnson that allowed him to pass such difficult legislation?
He wanted to call on senators and representatives to pass a civil rights bill, the most sweeping since Reconstruction. Most of his staff counseled him against it. And one particularly bold aide said, he did not believe a president should spend his time and power on lost causes, however worthy they might be. To which it is said, President Johnson replied, well, what the hell's the presidency for?
Many would cite his experience as majority leader of the United States Senate prior to his presidency. In the seniority-dominated Senate, Johnson managed to not only be the youngest majority leader in American history, but also the most powerful one up to that point.
Your technique of leadership is considerably different. If I may, I'd like to quote from a chap here who one observer's quoted one of your biographies. Being won over by Johnson is a rather overwhelming experience. The full treatment is an incredibly potent mixture of persuasion, badgering, flattery, threats, reminders of past favors and future advantages. That's a technique for leadership, obviously.
Throughout his entire life, Johnson had favored whatever position was more beneficial to him in that moment, both in politics and in personal matters. People who knew Johnson would say Lyndon goes where the wind blows. In his 1937 congressional campaign, Johnson rode the coattails of FDR's popularity as a true liberal and a New Dealer. This led to many meetings between these two masters of politics at the White House during Johnson's early political career. Johnson maintained this liberal appearance until FDR's death and the rise of New Deal skepticism, where he started to posture as a more conservative figure instead. Johnson's father told him as a young boy that you can't be in politics unless you can walk in a room and know in a minute who's for you and who's against you. LBJ took these words to heart as he would become an exceptional reader of men.
He understood the way the Senate worked. He understood what senators needed and what they wanted. He had biographies on each of them so that he knew what their tastes and intentions and aims and desires and wishes and hopes were.
Johnson had the ability to talk to you and figure out what you were saying before you even finished saying it. If he was trying to flatter someone, he would agree with their opinion and reach the conclusion they were working towards before they had, in order to appear more in agreement with them. Lyndon Johnson could pinpoint a person's biggest insecurity as easily as if it were simply written on their expression. If he knew that someone struggled with speaking, he would get in their good graces by saying something like, "Great speech, John," which would hit close to home for the other party. If Johnson sought to hurt you, however, he could use your biggest insecurity against you like a weapon.
LBJ taught 5th, 6th, and 7th graders in Cotulla, Texas. Can you imagine the experience of being an 11-year-old who forgot your homework and tried to explain it to Lyndon Johnson?
Once, Johnson was so dissatisfied with a cup of coffee from a recently divorced secretary that he screamed at her that her inability to make a coffee was why she couldn't keep a husband. But how did Johnson develop these qualities? The hunger and drive that would propel him from humble beginnings to the highest seats of power. His unique ambition and the cruelty that came in service of it. What environment shaped this master of politics? How did young Lyndon Johnson become the LBJ we know today? Lyndon Johnson was born to idealistic parents in the hill country of Texas, a place where idealism goes to die. After traversing what seemed like never-ending flatland, many settlers fell for the trap that was the beautiful Texas hill country. A mirage of prosperity whose beauty was quite literally only skin deep. The plentiful grass laid on top of shallow soil whose nutrients were not easily replaced. Even that beautiful green grass had been growing for several years, uninterrupted by human settlement. The farmers who settled the hill country were encouraged by their early successes, only to see diminishing returns every following year as they depleted the area's natural resources. Despite being part of the United States in the 20th century, the life of someone in the hill country of Texas looked more like that of a medieval peasant. With no running water, electricity, or plumbing, these people led very difficult lives. The people of the hill country weren't just poor, they were poor in one of the worst areas to live in the entire country. A place where everyone had to work themselves to death just to get by. A place where people worked so hard that they would die fast and age even faster.
There's no other place, no Virgin Islands, no Miami coastlines, no boat trips across the Atlantic that can do for me what this soil and what this land and what this water and what this people and what these hills and these surroundings can do. They represent the memories of half a century, and they provide the stimulation and the inspiration that nothing else or no one else can provide.
The Johnson family had been fighting the natural decline of the hill country's prosperity for generations. Triumph followed by tragedy, time and time again, a family cursed by a vicious cycle. LBJ's father, Sam Ely Johnson, was a politician who prided himself as an honest figure, someone who stayed away from the corruption and bribery that was all too common in his time. The elder Johnson worked hard to cultivate his image as a good, honest man, someone who you could trust and depend on. Mr. Sam, as he was known in Johnson City, wanted to be respected, and he did so by keeping up his appearance. He invested in expensive suits and a nice car, things that someone of his status should definitely be able to afford. The problem was that he couldn't. As previously stated, the elder Johnson was an honest politician, but honesty doesn't pay, especially in those days. Sam Johnson could barely even afford to stay in Austin during the legislative sessions. This and other financial troubles would eventually lead to him giving up his seat in the Texas House of Representatives in 1923. Most politicians could find a good job in the private sector based off of the relationships they had cultivated with lobbyists. But Johnson hadn't cultivated any relationships with lobbyists. In fact, he explicitly avoided them. Left without the type of position that would usually be given to a former statesman, Mr. Sam would then fall into a series of bad business decisions that would lead him into massive debt, unable to provide for his family. The once respected Sam Johnson was now the laughingstock of their small town. He owed so much money to banks and stores in town that he would actually have to visit other towns in order to find someone who was willing to lend it to him. After a while, even this stopped working because even the other towns started to catch on. In a twist of irony, Mr. Sam would end up working as a day laborer on a road that he himself had authorized the building of as a state representative. But let's rewind. Before he ran out of money, before he lost his social standing, before he failed, let's go back to the happiest day of Sam Ely Johnson's life. August 27th, 1908, Lyndon Johnson was born. During Johnson's boyhood, he would develop some peculiar tendencies that would go on to define the rest of his life. If the young Johnson couldn't lead whatever group he was playing with, he didn't want to play at all. Lyndon was bossy, but he was also a crybaby who would whine if he didn't get what he wanted. Young LBJ possessed something that almost no one in his entire town had: a ball. And ever the cunning young man, Johnson made sure to use this to his advantage. LBJ was a terrible pitcher, but if the other boys didn't let him pitch, he would just take his ball and go home. Lyndon Johnson had to stand out. He could not bear to be one in a crowd. Not in Congress, not in college, not in a group of young boys. The life of Lyndon Johnson is like something out of a Shakespeare play. His dramatic rise and fall is one of the most interesting in American history. If you're enjoying this video, you're probably into epic stories like LBJ's. If that's the case, you might enjoy this video's sponsor, Bobbletopia. They have a lot of awesome bobbleheads like one of LBJ himself and an array of other historical figures and fictional characters. Use code AndreDutra for 10% off your bobblehead of choice, and make sure to let me know which one you get in the comment section down below. Any purchase you make directly helps out the channel, and it's a great way to support me if you enjoy the content. The son of an honest and idealistic politician fallen from grace, what lessons would Sam Johnson pass on to his son? Honestly, not many. LBJ saw what honesty and goodwill did to his parents. With no money and even less goodwill, the talkative Johnson would become quiet and depressed whenever he was reminded of his status. Even as a teenager, LBJ wanted to be popular. He wanted to be a leader among men, but honestly, he just wasn't. He was tall and skinny and awkward. In the Caro book, there's plenty of descriptions of Johnson walking around everywhere, just kind of throwing his really, really long arms around, and people would just take notice of that. And it's honestly just funny to think about this future president just kind of striding down with his skinny long arms looking all goofy. Before he left politics, Sam Johnson would take his oldest son Lyndon to the state legislature with him, and Lyndon was enthralled by the experience. As a child, LBJ got his first look at real power, and for the rest of his life, he never wanted anything else so badly.
All of my life, I have wanted to be a public servant. My father ahead of me was, and I grew up wanting to help people with their problems. And I get a satisfaction and a sense of achievement from constructive efforts on behalf of human beings that you can't get in almost any other profession.
From a very young age, little Lyndon was already telling people he was going to be the president of the United States one day, and every decision that he made in his life going forward was in service of that goal. Johnson wanted to escape the poverty and humiliation that defined his early life, and attaining power was the way he was going to do it. An important talent that the young Johnson developed during this time was his ability to make older people like him. While all the other kids played, Johnson would spend hours upon hours talking to their parents. In these moments, the loud, brash Johnson became kind and polite, listening closely to what they said and agreeing with every word. LBJ was as pleasant with parents as he was terrible with his fellow children. He might have been bossy and mean with his peers, but with any adult, he was the perfect son. This talent, of course, wasn't just limited to his hometown. While he was in college, LBJ would sit on the floor, put his hands on his face, and listen to his professors talk, listening very closely and agreeing with every word that they said. As long as you were in a position to help Lyndon Johnson, he would kiss up to you better than anybody else. He might agree with one professor on something, then 10 minutes later agree with a different professor who was saying the opposite. This would lead to the other students on campus referring to him as Bullshit Johnson. In Congress, liberals thought he was liberal and conservatives thought that he was a conservative. The professional son thing? He would go on to do that with legendary masters of politics like FDR and Sam Rayburn, and this talent was part of what brought him closer to the power that he sought so desperately. His childhood poverty filled Lyndon with an insatiable need for wealth. Psychologically, he needed money and needed it badly. Johnson's congressional campaigns were aided by construction company Brown & Root and the oil men behind it, in exchange for Johnson representing their interests on Capitol Hill. While Johnson was still a member of the House of Representatives, he was offered a golden ticket by his corporate backers, a lucrative oil investment worth nearly $1 million at the time that was basically gifted to LBJ with no strings attached. Johnson, however, turned down the deal, saying that, quote, having oil money would kill me politically. This caused confusion as Johnson represented the state of Texas, where oil money didn't exactly hurt a politician. Any hopes of becoming governor or senator in the future would not be affected. It was at this point they realized there was only one office where having oil would hurt LBJ, and that was the presidency. Johnson would eventually own a radio and TV empire, which made him a millionaire. The Johnson media business was supposedly ran solely by his wife without his input whatsoever, even though that is easily disproven. The only thing that LBJ wanted more than money was power. As long as Johnson's path to power was open, nothing, not even $1 million could get in the way of it. His entire life, he needed power. He needed to be the one in control. This man that became one of the great politicians of the 21st century was so motivated by his ambition that no matter how far back you look, you can see him acting in service of it at every single step. Every cruel and savage action made solely in service of his ambition and quest for power. One story that stuck out to me was that Sam Johnson was going to take his teenage son Lyndon to Austin one day in order to buy Lyndon a suit. Of course, the family had already fallen on hard times, so Sam was likely going to get Lyndon the cheapest suit that he possibly could. Lyndon, however, did not want a cheap suit, and he decided that he was going to drive to Austin the day before with one of his friends and meet up with the tailor he was supposed to visit with his dad. When he arrived at the tailor, Johnson got fitted for one of the more expensive suits that were available in the shop. He then told the tailor that he was going to come back the next day with his dad, but told the tailor to pretend like he had never seen him before. LBJ then told the tailor to recommend the expensive suit to his father right off the bat when they get there, his father not knowing that LBJ had already been fitted for it. His father wanted to keep up appearances, and because of this, he ended up just buying the extremely expensive suit. This is just one example of the extreme manipulation that LBJ was capable of from a very young age. In many ways, LBJ sought to emulate his father, but in many others, he sought to surpass him. The two men even bore a significant physical resemblance to each other, as they had large noses and large ears that were very distinguishing features. There was one similarity between the two Johnson men that Lyndon would be tortured by for his entire life. Throughout Johnson's childhood, he heard his family discussing how Johnson men had weak hearts. This was such a prevalent topic of conversation that people began to say Johnson men don't live past 60. This proved to be hauntingly true when Sam Johnson, after suffering multiple heart attacks throughout his life, was finally killed by one in 1937 at just 60 years old. LBJ's awareness of his limited time on Earth is one of the most important facts in understanding his insatiable drive. The reason he worked unimaginably hard and abused others until they did the same. The reason he could never waver on his pursuit of what he so deeply craved. In addition to a genetic predisposition, Johnson was known to work 20-hour days filled with sleep deprivation, unhealthy eating, heavy drinking, and of course, smoking 60 cigarettes a day. Johnson would suffer from his first heart attack at age 47, which he described as the worst heart attack a man could have and still live. He would suffer a second heart attack at 55, a third at 63, a fourth at 64, and a fifth fatal heart attack at age 65.
I'm talking to Tom Johnston, the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, who has reported that the 36th President of the United States died this afternoon in an ambulance plane on the way to San Antonio, where he was taken after being stricken at his ranch, the LBJ Ranch in Johnson City, Texas.
This video doesn't touch on anywhere near the full extent of LBJ's ambition and the cruelty that he used to service it. There is so much content in the Caro books that frankly I could do an entire series on LBJ
LBJ, and that might be the plan depending on how this video goes. The life of Lyndon Johnson is a story of epic proportions, and I can't do it justice with just this one video. It only touches on a small part of the first novel, and I recommend more than anything that you read the series. I'm currently obsessed with it.
To tell the story of civil rights in the United States is to tell the story of mass suffering. Suffering that was caused by hate, bigotry, and a system that was fundamentally built to slow progress. While there are countless people that worked extremely hard and even gave their lives for the cause of equality, this video will focus primarily on one man and his role in ensuring equal rights for Americans of every color. Lyndon Johnson was not perfect. He was an incredibly flawed man who, despite his passage of civil rights, did convey on numerous occasions his own personal racism. This video focuses on Lyndon Johnson not because he is the perfect champion of civil rights, but instead because he is the president who was able to get it done. A poor man's son, born and raised in one of the most forgotten parts of the country, who managed to accomplish what no president before him could. I'm fascinated by Lyndon Johnson not because I love everything that he did, but because of his unique political talent and the contradictions in his character. This is my second video about LBJ based on Robert Caro's incredible book series, The Years of Lyndon Johnson. I have all 4 volumes right here, and as you can see, they're pretty hefty. I was very intimidated by the idea of reading these, but I can confidently say now that it's honestly my favorite book series. It's one that made me look at history and politics in a whole new light, and honestly, it's changed my life. I don't know if I would be making the same kind of videos that I am on this channel without it. This video won't be looking at LBJ's civil rights legislation. There's plenty of great videos and documentaries about that already. Instead, I wanted to take a look at why civil rights was so difficult to achieve and why it took Lyndon Johnson to do it. Despite the Civil War ending nearly a century prior to Lyndon Johnson's time in office, Black Americans were still denied the basic rights of American citizenship. While the American South and its 11 former Confederate states had the immense power necessary to maintain segregation, there's one thing that they couldn't do: elect a president. The northern states were heavily populated and carried much more power in choosing the Democratic presidential nominee. In the 100 years between the administrations of Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Baines Johnson, not a single Southerner had been elected to the presidency. No matter how powerful and charismatic a Southern leader was, the fact that they were Southern was enough to hold them back from the nation's highest honor. Legendary Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn was at one point gifted a plaque that read, "To our beloved Sam Rayburn, who would have been president if he had come from any place but the South." In walks Lyndon Johnson, a true creature of Washington. The larger-than-life Texas politician was one of the most ambitious, power-hungry people that Washington had ever seen, and that says a lot. It was the South that would raise Lyndon Johnson to the heights of political power, and it was at the hands of Lyndon Johnson that the South would suffer its greatest defeat in 100 years. To the Southern Democrats that brought him to power, Lyndon Johnson would become a Judas, one of their own who broke ranks and betrayed them. While Johnson had initially been elected to Congress as a New Deal Democrat who cozied up to FDR, he was ideologically inconsistent and would outright lie to those around him in order to appear in agreement with them. Johnson even caught the admiration of old Speaker Rayburn, who was a notoriously grumpy man. The short, angry Rayburn was an intimidating figure to almost everyone in Washington. Because of this, many people were shocked when they saw LBJ come up and kiss the speaker on his big bald head. As long as you were in a position to help Lyndon Johnson, he would suck up to you better than anybody else. LBJ is often described as a professional son with a unique talent for making older men and women grow fond of him. This was particularly useful for Johnson's career in Congress, as Congress was an old man's game. Leadership roles in the House and Senate weren't given based off of merit, they were given based off of seniority. If you wanted to be the chairman of a committee, your best bet was to join that committee and then do your best to outlive and outlast everyone else there until it was your turn. This wasn't good enough for the ambitious Johnson, who did not expect to live very long. There was a saying in the Johnson family that Johnson men don't live past 60, and for the most part that's proven itself to be true. Even with millions of dollars and healthcare fit for a president, Johnson himself wouldn't live past 64. This fear of death lit a fire under Johnson, which meant he would not be able to take the traditional path to power that was laid out for him. The House of Representatives was beholden to the passions of the electorate. The Senate was actually made for the opposite purpose. The United States Senate was created as a force of moderation, a steady hand that would prevent the country from moving too fast in any direction. While members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years, members of the Senate are only re-elected every 6. Lyndon Johnson arrived in the upper chamber of Congress in 1949, just a young man in his 40s with no seniority whatsoever. What Johnson did have was the ability to kiss up to older men, an ability that would take him to the heights of political power faster than almost anyone else. Richard Brevard Russell was the United States Senator from Georgia and the most powerful figure in the Senate. Russell was an old-school Southern gentleman. He believed in preserving the Southern way of life the way that he saw it, which of course meant preserving segregation.
The legend of the antebellum South. Elegant Neo-Grecian mansions. Coquettish belles under the magnolias. Dancing with young men, gallant and reckless, ready to duel for a lady's honor. The kindly master ruling his kingdom with justice and humanity, and served by his faithful, contented lackeys.
Russell wasn't as outwardly racist as many of his fellow Southern senators, such as Strom Thurmond. He believed in being a true gentleman, which basically meant coding his racist beliefs under a veneer of respectability. He felt that doing things like constantly spouting out the N-word made the South look backwards and prejudiced. Another important fact about Russell is that he was an unmarried man with no children, a man of great responsibility but no immediate family to call his own. This is something he had in common with the aforementioned Sam Rayburn. Another thing these two Southern leaders had in common was their affinity for professional son Lyndon Johnson. An affinity that was no coincidence. You don't just go around and make two of the most powerful men in Washington your father figures on accident.
Overlooking the city of Washington is the legislative center of American life, the U.S. Capitol. As our country faces important challenges at home and abroad, the new 82nd Congress convenes. Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas is Senate Whip.
Back then, the Senate worked differently from how we understand it today. The majority leader wasn't nearly as powerful and thus was a less desirable position. Despite his total lack of seniority, Russell's love for Johnson allowed him to become the Assistant Democratic Leader, or Minority Whip, in 1951, just 3 years after he first entered the chamber. This was completely unprecedented, but then again, so was Johnson's ambition. He would become Minority Leader in 1953 and Majority Leader in 1954. Not only was Johnson Majority Leader during his first term, he was the youngest Majority Leader in American history. I just want to reiterate how insane that is. All of Congress had been built on seniority, and in just a couple of years, Lyndon Johnson threw that out the window. In the coming years, Lyndon Johnson would bend the most stubborn institution in all of American politics to his will. He became the master of the Senate. Richard Russell hated the fact that no Southerner had been elected president in nearly a century. While the South held strength in the Senate, Russell felt they had never been fully redeemed in the eyes of the country as a whole. He felt that it would take a president from his beloved Southland to heal that great wound. Russell himself would try for the office, but to no avail. The old Southerner recognized the sheer political talent of his protege and felt he could be the one to finally make it across the finish line. But for a Southern Democrat to win the presidency, it was going to take an extraordinary effort. To achieve his dream, Russell was willing to bend the rules of the Senate, which he had guarded so diligently. His love for Johnson, combined with the commitment to electing a Southern president, would open the floodgates of Johnson's political power. The Senate was built on seniority. If you wanted a chairmanship, you were going to have to wait. Your qualifications or expertise didn't matter. All that mattered was how long you had been there. Because of this, the Senate was a slow-moving machine, but that was about to change. Johnson was Majority Leader, and he had his eyes on the presidency. In order to reach that goal, he was going to need an incredible record. Johnson went to Russell with an idea. What if Johnson could assign committee seats and chairmanships as he pleased? That way, the Senate could move at a more productive pace and Johnson could build more of a reputation for himself. Russell allowed it, and suddenly everything changed. The Senate was suddenly moving more than ever, and doing so at Johnson's command. This man was clearly a leader of men. The 1950s were an extremely tense time in American history, which saw anger against Southern injustice. While they still controlled the levers of power, the South's ability to overcome the obstacles was starting to appear thin. While they could control legislation, they needed a Southerner in the White House to solidify their place. The problem is that the Democratic National Convention was never going to choose a Southern Democrat as their nominee, not as long as civil rights was hanging in the background. In an effort to make Johnson more palatable to the Northern Democrats, Russell and his fellow Southerners would allow LBJ to go forward with a Civil Rights Act, albeit a toothless one. But the passage of this law, however symbolic, would soon open the floodgates for all the landmark legislation that we associate with Lyndon Johnson today.
Now, I have tried to do that by implementing the constitutional rights guaranteed to every citizen with 2 civil rights bills during the 3 Congresses that I have been leader.
Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy all tried to address the question of civil rights during their presidencies, but they mostly failed. Passing the Civil Rights Act took Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had never supported civil rights in his entire career, a man who owed so much of his political success to the very people he would now be fighting. Lately, I've gotten a lot of really nice comments talking about how fair and unbiased my videos are, and while I appreciate that, the truth is that no one can ever truly be unbiased. But that's why I use this video sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that combines news from around the world in one place so you can compare coverage. For every news source, you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable the reporting is, and who owns them. They even have a blind spot feed that highlights news that is being disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. It's so easy to get stuck inside of your own political bubble, and Ground News helps you get information from thousands of sources worldwide in one place. It lets you get news from diverse perspectives and from sources that you otherwise would have missed. You can use code andredutratv to get 15% off your subscription, and any purchase that you make directly goes to help out the channel. Thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring the video. Johnson consistently voted against every civil rights measure he came across. He had opposed an anti-lynching bill, military integration, and ending the poll tax. He went as far as to call Harry Truman's civil rights program a police state. Johnson was willing to take whatever position necessary to get power. Whatever compassion he had was outweighed by ambition. What could possibly make this shrewd, calculating politician put all of his political capital into passing civil rights? Lyndon Johnson grew up in the hill country of Texas. His dad had been an honest politician who fell on hard times because he didn't participate in the political corruption so common in that era. It was common in the South for black people to do the most physically demanding manual labor jobs. There weren't many black people in the hill country, however, so the kind of grueling work that would usually fall on them instead ending up going to the poorest white people. One of these people was a young Lyndon Johnson. From the ages of 17 to 18, young LBJ worked on a road gang building a highway from the hill country to Austin in the hot Texas sun.
To begin with, workmen set up a heavy steel track along each side of the road. Now the roadway has become a highway. Highways that let us travel quickly and safely, if we're careful, wherever we want to go.
This was back-breaking work for the tall, slender Johnson who detested exercise. It's possible that this experience and the ridicule Johnson suffered due to his poverty gave him a greater compassion for the downtrodden, the poor people and racial minorities in society that had been the victims of circumstance. At every turn in his life, LBJ chose ambition. He followed whatever road he could on his path to power, no matter how narrow it was. Johnson's parents had been idealists that went out of their way to help others, but after their fall from grace, they became the laughingstock of their small town. LBJ decided he needed to appear cold, calculating, and shrewd in order to not end up destitute like his parents did. Robert Caro writes, he always had this true, deep compassion to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. But even stronger than the compassion was his ambition. But when the two aligned, when compassion and ambition finally are pointing in the same direction, Lyndon Johnson became a force for racial justice unequaled, certainly since Lincoln. During college, Johnson took up a teaching job to be able to pay for his classes. He taught at a Mexican school in the small town of Cotulla, Texas. Lyndon Johnson knew poverty, but he had never seen anything as bad as this. Teachers came and went, but no one had ever really cared for these children, taken the extra step to make sure they got a quality education. The thing about Lyndon Johnson is that he could never do anything halfway. He always had to be the best. He had to stand out. He had to be a leader. Johnson took this job very seriously and was putting in extra hours to make sure the kids were getting a better education. This school didn't even have a ball for the kids to play with, but LBJ made sure they got one. The school janitor, Thomas Coronado, didn't even speak English, but Johnson was on a mission to make sure he did. So 20-year-old Lyndon Johnson starts meeting up with Coronado before and after every school day to give him English lessons. While working on civil rights legislation, Johnson would often reminisce and tell stories about teaching these school children.
My first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry. And they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice. They never seemed to know why people disliked them, but they knew it was so, because I saw it in their eyes. I often walked home late in the afternoon after the classes were finished, wishing there was more that I could do. But all I knew was to teach them the little that I knew, hoping that it might help them against the hardships that lay ahead. And somehow you never forget what poverty and hatred can do when you see its scars on the hopeful face of a young child. I never thought then, in 1928, that I would be standing here in 1965. It never even occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students and to help people like them all over this country. But now I do have that chance. And I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it.
Lyndon Johnson's talent as a politician is multifaceted, but if I could sum it up with one word, it would be salesman. A friend of Johnson's once described him as the greatest salesman one-on-one that ever lived. In a conversation with just one other person, Johnson could convince anyone of anything. Now it was time for the great salesman to make his hardest sale of all, civil rights. Part of why Johnson's salesman accolade comes with the caveat one-on-one instead of just greatest salesman of all time is because frankly, Johnson was a big fat liar. Johnson would lie so blatantly and so often that in college he was known as Bullshit Johnson. But the thing about LBJ is he would get into these moods where he would work himself up not just to lie, but to believe that lie completely. Not only could Lyndon Johnson convince anyone of anything, he could convince himself of anything. And he needed to do that in order to fully dedicate himself to a cause. He badgered and he bullied all of his fellow lawmakers until they fell into agreement with him. In my research for this project, I came across a video of Senator Richard Russell, which really helps illustrate the Southern backlash to the new civil rights legislation at the time.
I greatly fear that the Vice President of the United States, who has recently been in conference with some of the leaders supporting this legislation, will join with them to wipe out any semblance of regular parliamentary procedure in the effort to cram this bill down our throats. I have stated on the floor of the Senate this afternoon that it seems that a legislative lynching of a minority is in prospect.
I kid you not, my jaw literally dropped when I saw that. The idea of this segregationist senator using the language of lynching a minority, with the minority being the Southern segregationists, is baffling. One of LBJ's trademarks was his famous Johnson treatment, where Johnson would get up into somebody's personal space and physically intimidate them with his large size. It's often talked about with this famous photo, but you might not know that this is actually LBJ's father figure and mentor, Richard Russell himself. In 1960, Lyndon Johnson made his first campaign for the presidency, but ultimately lost the Democratic primary to the younger John F. Kennedy. Johnson resented Kennedy as the privileged son of a rich man, an upbringing very different from his own. LBJ saw JFK as a lazy freshman senator who never showed up to work, let alone got anything done in the Senate that Johnson ran so efficiently. In Johnson's eyes, Kennedy was a lightweight who LBJ would dominate as he had done to many others. While campaigning against him for the nomination, Johnson tried to inform the press that Kennedy had Addison's disease, but what Johnson wasn't aware of was the extent of Kennedy's physical pain. If LBJ had known the resilience and sheer force of will that it took for Kennedy to conduct his daily life while maintaining the facade of a young, energetic leader, perhaps he would have seen Kennedy as a more credible opponent. Johnson would of course lose the nomination and join Kennedy's ticket as VP. I was actually able to get my hands on these two Kennedy-Johnson campaign buttons, which are very cool. They're quite small, but I think they look nice.
It started in July when the Democratic Party nominated Senator John F. Kennedy for President of the United States, and for Vice President, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. The party united behind its candidates.
Vice President Thomas R. Marshall famously said, "Once there were two brothers. One ran away to sea, the other was elected Vice President of the United States, and nothing was heard from either of them again." Why would LBJ, who'd fought and clawed his way up the political ladder to become the most powerful majority leader in American history, give up his role for the powerlessness and embarrassment of the vice presidency? Power is where power goes. These are words that Johnson lived by. Throughout his life, Johnson had occupied positions of little importance that he managed to mold into those of significant power through sheer political talent. So why would the vice presidency be any different? Johnson sought to maintain his hold over the Senate while vice president, a clear violation of the separation of powers. JFK, of course, wasn't going to let that happen. LBJ didn't think that much of Jack Kennedy and thought he would be fairly easy to control, but he thought wrong. Johnson's expertise and legislative ability would have been a gift for the Kennedy White House, which struggled greatly with Congress. To Johnson's frustration, he was not utilized whatsoever. Johnson and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, close advisor, and brother of the president, famously hated each other, dating back to when Bobby was just a Senate lawyer. The Kennedys were well aware of Johnson's political talent and his knack for grabbing power, which may have been one of the reasons they decided to keep him in arm's length. It's November of 1963. John F. Kennedy is dead, Lyndon Johnson is now president, and he decides to address a joint session of Congress. The good old boys from the Southern delegation were all together to witness the triumph of the first Southern president in 100 years. Johnson opens his speech with this incredible line.
All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
He then starts talking about John F. Kennedy, what he started, and how important it is to continue. He lists off a few things, then all of a sudden he lays out his top priority.
First, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law.
Something happened in the second half of the 20th century that fundamentally altered the way we view the American presidency. Growing cynicism and distrust of government that led to a tumultuous changing of hands at the White House. Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. All four of these men served as our nation's chief executive in just the 7-year period between 1974 and 1981. A stark contrast from the last few decades of American politics, where two-term presidencies became a norm, up until very recently, that is. One of the main subjects of this channel has been the post-war presidency, how our nation's highest office changed and evolved over the course of the back half of the American century. It's important to study the political coalitions that these figures represented and the realignments within them that led us to the modern day. Today, I wanted to tie together some of the shared themes from the previous videos into one common thread that provides an overview of how we lost trust in our politicians. Dwight D. Eisenhower served as president from 1953 until 1961. following FDR's 12-year tenure and Truman's 2 nearly complete terms. Americans were used to getting a solid, stable continuity of government, something that would change drastically during the Kennedy era. JFK was killed, LBJ chose not to seek re-election, Richard Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford failed to be elected in his own right, and Jimmy Carter lost re-election in a landslide. People lost faith in the presidency during the 1960s and 70s, and who could blame them? No commander-in-chief between Eisenhower and Reagan would serve 2 complete terms, a span of time in which the face and character of the nation would transform drastically. Eisenhower was a very popular president, but following his time in office, the World War II generation were ready to take up the mantle from the old general and see themselves reflected in the White House. The young and vigorous John F. Kennedy would be the first of these men whose generation would hold the office until nearly the end of the century. Veterans of the worst conflict in human history, tasked with the delicate balance of preventing even greater suffering. JFK wasn't universally loved during his presidency, but November 22, 1963, the day that Kennedy died, would freeze him in time, cementing his place as one of America's most beloved presidents, a spot I doubt he would have occupied had he lived. The romanticization of John Fitzgerald Kennedy following his tragic end was only exacerbated by the controversy and scandal of his successors. But Kennedy was no saint. He hid severe health issues and countless affairs from the public, affairs that journalists were well aware of but chose not to report on, in keeping with the standard practice of the time, because they felt a politician's personal life had no relevance to their ability to govern. FDR benefited greatly from this discretion as well, the wheelchair-bound president who hid his disability from the public, along with multiple years-long affairs, including one with his personal secretary. During World War II, this discretion from the press was due in part to Roosevelt's health being a national security issue. It was thought that it had to be a closely guarded secret because of the sheer challenges the nation was facing. This cooperation from the press would mostly continue for the duration of the Cold War for that very reason, though journalists would begin to address the presidency differently following the lies and deception of the Johnson and Nixon administrations. This, combined with changing societal issues, shows us why Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky wasn't given the same discretion. Lyndon Johnson had assumed the presidency with the image of an experienced elder statesman taking up the mantle of his fallen captain. In their stories, the press left out Johnson's vulgarity, temper, and harassment of nearly everyone around him. But LBJ was the turning point, the presidency that would mark the shift to a new kind of White House, one shrouded in scandal and secrecy surrounding the war in Vietnam, which would result in a massive wave of protests. Johnson's time in office also saw racial tensions at an all-time high, and 2 more high-profile assassinations following President Kennedy's. The presidency of Franklin Roosevelt had seen the rise of both the New Deal coalition and the New Deal consensus. The crisis of the Great Depression allowed Roosevelt to unite an array of blue-collar workers, including white Southerners, immigrants, and minority groups in big cities around economic programs meant to benefit these groups. This coalition lasted roughly until the Democratic embrace of civil rights legislation in the 1960s, when the party lost the support of the Deep South, which had been reliably Democratic since the Civil War. Most former Confederate states had only wavered during the 1948 election, when South Carolina Democratic Governor Strom Thurmond decided to launch a third-party bid for the presidency following Harry Truman's support for civil rights. Thurmond would carry Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and his native South Carolina. The realignment that took place over the question of civil rights can be seen very clearly in Thurmond's defection to the Republican Party in 1964, the same year where Johnson lost the Deep South despite winning a landslide victory. He was meant to be a great progressive, ensuring equal rights for Americans of all colors, and daring to go to war with a struggle as ubiquitous as poverty. But his presidency went down in flames following his handling of the increasingly controversial war. He finished out the final year of Kennedy's term before being elected to a landslide victory in his own right in 1964, and eventually having to drop out of the presidential race 4 years later because of his sheer unpopularity. But what candidate could take advantage of this tense political moment and use it to finally come to power? Richard Nixon was elected to the presidency by appealing to people's fears, particularly that of the silent majority, white working-class voters that felt left behind by the Johnson administration. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, would resign the office due to tax evasion, becoming only the second vice president in American history to do so. Jimmy Carter, the humble peanut farmer with a broad smile and a sweet southern accent, was the complete opposite of the shadowy political figure Nixon came to represent. He was the first president since Eisenhower to not have served in Congress, and the first since Wilson to have had no Washington experience. Jimmy Carter would be the first in a long line of Washington outsiders, lasting up until the election of Joe Biden to the presidency in 2020. The former governor of Georgia assumed the presidency as someone from outside the system that wasn't exactly eager to work within it. This correlates with his own sense of altruism and moral superiority compared to the stereotypical politicians he represented such a stark departure from. He preferred to work with his own staff that had been with him in the governor's mansion over the array of new advisors that came with the nation's highest office. He had been an engineer and sought to bring that sort of non-ideological, data-driven, pragmatic decision-making to the White House. Carter was honest, so honest in fact that he came off as pessimistic or uninspiring. He would often not even receive credit for his honesty because the press was inherently distrusting and suspicious of him following the Nixon and Johnson administrations. In comes Ronald Reagan, another Washington outsider who was the complete opposite of Carter. He had charm and wit so powerful that he would become known as the great communicator. He had been able to speak to and inspire the country in a way that Carter couldn't. Before his foray into politics, Reagan had been an actor. FDR was also a master performer. Upon meeting the actor Orson Welles, Roosevelt is said to have remarked, "Orson, you and I are the two best actors in America." Like Roosevelt, Reagan mastered the performance of the presidency. Jimmy Carter had been a moderate Democrat, the first to really chip away at the New Deal consensus. I'm fascinated by the interruption of historical trends. Jimmy Carter's 1976 electoral victory was a brief pause in party realignment following the Civil Rights Movement, in which the Democratic nominees swept the Deep South, momentarily regaining ground with some of the New Deal coalition Democratic constituencies of the region before they drifted back to being solidly Republican. It was Reagan, however, that would bring a revolution to American politics, recentering the party spectrum on a much more conservative axis. Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush would be elected Commander-in-Chief largely due to the popularity of their joint administration, despite not being the most fitting ideological successor for Reagan. Bush was a country club Republican, a relic from before the Reagan Revolution that changed the face of the party. He also interrupted political trends by being the only Washington insider elected between Carter and Biden. I have a whole video about this called The Last Politician, which you should definitely check out after this video if you haven't already. George H.W. Bush was no Ronald Reagan, no great communicator or even great conservative. Old man Bush just wasn't a great fit for the post-Reagan Republican Party. He was a figure from a bygone era and would end up being the last of the World War II generation to serve as president. Now here comes this sweet-talking Southern Democrat who was the same age as Bush's son, a baby boomer, and sought to bring a new generation of Democratic leadership. One that was different from Lyndon Johnson, that had adjusted to the post-Reagan Revolution landscape. Look at this clip of Bill Clinton.
The era of big government is over.
You wouldn't hear most Democrats say that today. Liberalism was on the way out. The New Deal consensus that defined Washington for so many years was over. If you were a Democrat and you wanted to be elected nationwide, you needed to use the Clintonite playbook of third way politics. Bill Clinton's greatest political talent was coding as a lovable hillbilly despite being an Oxford-educated Rhodes Scholar with a near photographic memory. The former governor of Arkansas still won some southern states. Of course, the Clinton administration would deal another huge blow to public trust in the presidency through Clinton's affair with young White House staffer Monica Lewinsky. Colorado Senator Gary Hart had been a promising presidential prospect for 1988, but his hopes were dashed by a photo of him with a young woman that wasn't his wife sitting on his lap. Hart was a womanizing adulterer, as many Washington politicians had been, but he was the first one to really be dealt a blow by the press's changing attitudes. A candidate's personal life used to be off limits, but now the rules had changed. Clinton was known to have had affairs prior to the Lewinsky scandal, and even addressed them while he was running for president with Hillary by his side. But now the public was getting salacious details about the president's sex life in a way that really discredited the office. Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, who led the charge to impeach Clinton, admitted to having an extramarital affair of his own at the same time. While Clinton's impeachment was over perjury he committed while covering up the affair and not the affair itself, the irony here shouldn't be lost on anyone. Love him or hate him, Barack Obama is an extraordinary political talent. And if you need any evidence why, just remember that a black guy named Barack Hussein Obama was elected to the United States presidency only 7 years after 9/11. In 2008, he won 365 electoral votes, about as close as you can get to a landslide in modern elections. The Republican Party had been the party of Reagan, with every subsequent leader fitting within that mold, until number 45 transformed it into the party of Trump. Donald Trump is a talented performer in a similar vein to Reagan, though he comes from a different background, one more fitting for the modern United States. He came from reality TV, a conflict-driven medium well-suited both to his personality and the political climate he would come to define. He had been a celebrity for decades, often appearing prominently in tabloids, which taught him valuable lessons in grabbing headlines and earned media. Trump is a sort of post-scandal president. He's often known as Teflon Don because nothing really sticks to him. Before Trump ever ran for president, he already had a reputation as an unfaithful womanizer. Most people aren't under some illusion that Trump is some wholesome family man. He spoke to a part of America that felt left behind and played on people's fears much like Nixon did. People like Trump because he pisses off the people that they hate, so questions surrounding his own character matter much less. In 2016, Trump needed someone with evangelical Christian appeal like Mike Pence on the ticket because they were the biggest Republican constituency that was hesitant about Trump due to questions surrounding his character. But he's the one who accomplished their biggest goal. He appointed pro-life judges to the court and got Roe v. Wade overturned, something the previous evangelical Republican presidents didn't. In the current realignment, we see large gender and diploma divides that have only been growing with every election. We are in a world where Dick Cheney is supporting the Democratic nominee. What happened? There's no telling really how to become less polarized, or how to regain trust in our politicians, or how those politicians could even necessarily earn our trust back. And as far as the realignment, I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
The presidency is a job of huge power and responsibility. We like to think of our leaders as hyper-competent people uniquely suited for the world's most difficult job, but that's not always the case. Presidents are people too. For the entire length of their term, the commander-in-chief needs to be on call 24 hours a day, with no downtime. Unless they're doodling, of course. I'm kidding. Presidents spend a lot of time in tedious meetings absorbing dense information, and doodling can be something that helps them focus or at least combats restlessness. I'm a big believer in humanizing history, looking at these larger-than-life figures on a more personal level in order to better understand how history happens in real time. The things that these men scribbled on paper are incredibly interesting, and if nothing else, shows you what they were thinking at a given moment.
I got the idea for this video from a fantastic Washington Post article that sorts presidential doodles from the most abstract to the most realistic. The article tackles it from an artistic perspective, however, and I thought it would be interesting to take a look at it in terms of what the drawings say about the president's personalities. Andrew Jackson, who I think I actually have never covered on the channel somehow, drew this funny little picture of an alligator. At first, I thought this was in reference to his rival John Quincy Adams, who famously owned an alligator, but apparently they were also associated with Jackson's military career and victory in the Battle of New Orleans. You'll notice that using doodles to reminisce about your physical or military prime is going to be a pretty common theme throughout this video. Theodore Roosevelt often drew playful pictures and letters that he wrote to his children and family. Here you can see what looks like a mom disciplining two little boys. These say a little less about Roosevelt, as they were made specifically to be given to someone rather than something that he just doodled during a meeting. Warren G. Harding's doodles are more of their time than any other president's, reflecting the Art Deco style that was popular in the 1920s and 30s. However, he also had this little doodle of some guy looking at an ostrich, so what do I know?
But in 1952, the American people wanted a change, and they brought it about with a landslide victory for General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Take a look at the self-portrait that Dwight Eisenhower drew on a White House memo, showing a muscular young Eisenhower complete with hair and a comically thin waistline. Clearly, Eisenhower was advocating for a snatched waist. I like this one because reminiscing about their physical prime seems to be such a cliche among older men, and seeing quite literally the most powerful man in the world doing this humanizes him significantly. In keeping with the drawing's quite masculine nature, there are also gunboats in the back, harkening back to Eisenhower's military career, much like Jackson did. If you have a keen eye, you may have noticed that the memo says Guatemala, whose president had been deposed by US-backed forces just one day prior. Here's another drawing done by Eisenhower which depicts a knife being broken in half with another knife. Perhaps he was thinking about disarming another country's military, or he just liked knives. In one of his drawings, John F. Kennedy pondered the question which would define the rest of the 1960s.
We are assisting in every way we properly can the people of South Vietnam who with the greatest courage and with under danger are attempting to maintain their freedom. Now this is a area where there is a good deal of danger, and it's a matter of information. We don't want to have information which is of assistance to the enemy, and it's a matter which I think will have to be worked out with the government of Vietnam, which bears the primary responsibility.
This is one of the more interesting drawings, in my opinion, with a million dots drawn around intersecting rectangles and the word Vietnam repeating throughout the page. Kennedy was famously thoughtful, and I can picture him just jotting this down while his mind wandered. I mentioned this in my recent Nixon video, but I'm really interested in thinking about what JFK's legacy would look like if he had survived and had to address the issues that ultimately led to the downfall of his successor. Kennedy is very romanticized because of his assassination, but this drawing is a reminder that when it comes to Vietnam, he ironically dodged a bullet.
As all presidents, Lyndon Johnson has sought this role, so he cannot complain of its rigors. He has assumed great personal control of the apparatus of government, and so the demands on his time and energy rise. The enormous pressures of schedule, problems, and decision burden his mind.
If you're familiar with this channel at all, you'll know that I'm obsessed with Lyndon Johnson. LBJ's eccentricities are well documented, but his doodles are even weirder. He often drew strange, misshapen creatures that you might expect to find in the notebooks of a bored high school student. I enjoy the way he incorporates the White House stationery logo at the top of the paper into a lot of his drawings. Most of LBJ's doodles don't really point to much besides him being a pretty weird, if creative guy, but my personal favorite is his drawing of Robert F. Kennedy. Johnson and Kennedy, of course, hated each other, and it's obvious that the threat of his former Attorney General primarying him loomed large over his already tumultuous presidency. This drawing in particular reflects Johnson's paranoia and feeling that everybody was out to get him. Richard Nixon was also famously paranoid, but his drawings reflect a very different side of his personality. With complex geometric shapes composed of countless straight lines. Nixon was a gifted student and talented piano player, and the precision in which he used in his approach to things are reflected in his doodling.
For those who've abandoned hope,
We'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
Ronald Reagan summed himself up pretty well in his drawings, intentionally or not. This paper features a younger Reagan calling back to his days acting in westerns. Some of the figures in the drawings are ones that Reagan often repeated throughout his life. Here's a few other ones that Reagan made with a couple familiar faces. Clearly, Mr. Reagan thought pretty highly of himself, just given the way that he draws his self-portraits. But in all seriousness, Reagan does cast himself as some sort of perfect Americana figure. From acting in westerns, a fictional romanticized version of the past, to running the original Make America Great Again campaign, it appears Reagan sees himself as representing a hero from a simpler time. While George W. Bush is famous for his post-presidency painting career, he clearly wasn't much of an artist while in the Oval. Bush's secretary had asked him to sign a few letters, and the president responded with this note, which features just a simple sad face informing her that one of the intended recipients had passed away. This speaks to George W. Bush just being a pretty regular guy. Honestly, nothing too fancy, just a sad face. While he was a US Senator, Barack Obama made a couple drawings of his Senate colleagues. Unlike the other doodles featured, these were made specifically for public view as they were being donated to charity. The drawing features Senators Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid, Dianne Feinstein, and Ted Kennedy. These are surprisingly good caricatures, and I bet that Obama feels pretty good about them himself. Let me be clear.
My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
Ruthless, cold-blooded, warm, and compassionate. These are all words used to describe Robert Francis Kennedy, a walking contradiction of a man, defined by his passion and intensity, for better or for worse. The world isn't black and white, though that's how Bobby often saw it. Right and wrong, good and evil, heroes and villains. Ironically enough, this worldview informs us on the moral gray areas within Kennedy himself. To me, RFK is the most interesting out of the Kennedy clan, not just because of his lost potential, but also because of his capacity for change. In my opinion, the greatest American leaders are those that go through some form of midlife crisis, a significant change in their lives that forces them to grow and challenges their sense of certainty. In the case of Robert F. Kennedy, we can see a clear contrast between how he governed before and after his brother's assassination. The Kennedy family philosophy was winning. Anything else was downright sinful. Joseph P. Kennedy made it his life's mission to see his oldest son elected president, an immense burden that would be passed down to all four of his male heirs. But he didn't force his ideology upon them, and if anything, he encouraged independent political thought. The third of the Kennedy sons, who devoted himself completely to his brother's presidential aspirations before assuming the burden himself, only to suffer the same tragic fate. A man who started his career as a Cold Warrior attack dog for Joseph McCarthy and ended up becoming the voice of liberalism, speaking out for the poorest people in the country. The smallest of the Kennedy men, Bobby made up for his size with a remarkable intensity.
Well, Bobby Kennedy I met when he was working for Joe McCarthy. See, I was an investigator and so was he. He was very intense, very different from Jack. I remember Alice Longworth used to describe the three Kennedy brothers, and she used to revel in how different they were. She said Jack Kennedy was a debonair man of the world, a movie star, and Bobby Kennedy was an 18th century Jesuit priest. And Teddy Kennedy was a gregarious Irish politician, and I think that says it well. Bobby Kennedy was humorless. I've often heard Jack Kennedy laugh and tell funny things. I didn't know Bobby that well, but from what I've been reading about him, he was very intense, very hardworking, very dedicated. But he could be dedicated to anything he was in at the particular time. He was totally dedicated to McCarthy and what he was doing. And John McClellan, who was the overall chairman of that committee, said that he had never seen a more dedicated, hard-working man than Bobby Kennedy when he was working for McCarthy and then for McClellan.
The Kennedys were a physical family with an emphasis on strength and vigor. Bobby, the runt of the litter, made for the weakest athlete and the most awkward of all the boys.
I think probably Bobby could be singled out as the most thoughtful and considerate of all the Kennedy children. The rest of them were very pleasant and thoughtful to an extent, but I think Bobby was more loyal and considerate to strangers and to people outside the family than the rest of the children were.
This is my first trip to Europe, and I was very excited. I couldn't even sleep last night.
Joe Kennedy didn't expect much from his third son, but as Bob came of age, the other Kennedy made a realization. The passion, single-mindedness, and quite frankly, the sheer vindictive nature of Robert Kennedy were all quite similar to Joe. In fact, Bobby was the most like his father out of any of the 9 siblings. A quote often attributed to Joseph Kennedy says that Bobby hates like me. He was extremely competitive. He needed to win, to come out on top in anything that he did, to prove it to himself and to his father, to deserve the Kennedy name. He felt things more deeply than the rest of the Kennedy children, whether that be love or hatred, contempt or compassion. Joe Kennedy would often compliment his son by saying, "When Bobby hates you, you stay hated." These similarities would lead to the patriarch advocating for Bobby joining JFK's campaign staff. The Kennedys were a tight-knit family, hesitant to trust those outside of their ranks. Family always came first, and the patriarch felt his often overlooked son would be a valuable asset. John was hesitant as he didn't expect much from his little brother, who was 8 years his junior. The two hadn't yet developed the intimate relationship that would become so famous. Little did he know his kid brother would be the linchpin of his campaign. For Jack's first run for the Senate in 1952, Bobby signed up 28,000 volunteers to go out knocking on doors. He brilliantly integrated the large Kennedy family into the campaign, having each one of them go out and stump for Jack. They would even advertise that JFK was fulfilling the dream of his brother Joe, who had died in World War II. The family shunned the state's Democratic power brokers, including its Irish-American incumbent governor, Paul Dever, who scornfully noted, "If Jack was the first Irish Brahmin, Bobby was the last Irish Puritan." The deeply ingrained, insatiable need to win had served the Kennedys well, with JFK eventually winning an impressive 71,000 vote margin of victory, despite Republican Dwight Eisenhower carrying Massachusetts by 200,000 votes. It was in this campaign that the Kennedy legend would expand beyond just John and Joe. This was the start of the Kennedy brothers, a pairing that neither had seen coming, but that both would increasingly depend on. Following this campaign success, Robert Kennedy became the assistant counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, headed by the infamous red-baiting demagogue Joseph McCarthy, a fellow Irish Catholic and family friend who old Joe Kennedy contributed to financially. McCarthy owed the Kennedy patriarch favors, and one of them would be Bobby's appointment. But this was no job Bobby took out of sheer convenience. As always, he was standing firm on his convictions. In law school, Kennedy had defended McCarthy and attacked Franklin Roosevelt for appeasing the Soviets. Bobby may have been smaller than the rest of his siblings, but he was scrappier and more willing to play dirty. He saw his time with McCarthy as a moral crusade to protect the country from communist infiltration. The Wisconsin senator made wild claims, fear-mongering with dubious evidence. Even Bobby's own brother Jack was much more wary of McCarthy and was hesitant to be associated with him. Robert would only spend 7.5 months in that position, but he would remain a loyal friend of McCarthy for the rest of his life, even attending his funeral despite Jack's urging him not to, though Bobby would ask journalists not to report on him being there. This is a perfect illustration of Bobby. Loyalty above all else, but never without political consideration. Take a look at this clip where he downplays his involvement with McCarthy during his New York Senate race.
I was not involved in any of the communist hearings of Senator McCarthy during that period of time which I worked for the committee. I worked for the committee for approximately 6 months. I disagreed with what was happening on the committee, which I did not have any personal involvement, but other things that they were doing. I was a member of the staff. I reached the conclusion that I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I went to Senator McCarthy and I said that I disagreed with what they were doing and I wasn't going to stay with the committee any longer, and I left. in June of 1953. I went then with the Hoover Commission.
Though his ideology would shift significantly in the coming years, Kennedy's time on the subcommittee would give him credibility as a staunch anti-communist that would come in handy later on when he finally came out against the Vietnam War. Kennedy's next endeavor would see him become chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee, another moral crusade the righteous young man could engage with head-on, and one that would continue during his time as Attorney General.
In 1957, he was chief counsel to the subcommittee investigating improper activities in labor and management. Here, he would make some lasting political friendships and a famous enemy. It was his first public service at his brother's side, but it would not be his last.
In this role, he started a long-lasting feud with Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa. RFK's time as chief counsel would earn him nationwide recognition even before his brother's presidential campaign.
No doubt you are aware of the fact that this rumor has been floating around, the rumor to the effect that you expect to resign as counsel of the committee at the strategic moment to aid your brother, Senator Jack Kennedy, and his campaign for the 1960 Democratic nomination. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I understand that he's only trying to be a good senator from Massachusetts, so I have no plans along those lines.
You're planning to be a good counsel for a while longer?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Thank you very much, and nice to see you.
Thank you.
It was during this time as a young Senate lawyer that Kennedy would meet Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, who would become one of his greatest rivals.
And I am grateful, finally, that I can rely in the coming months on many others, on a distinguished running mate who brings unity and strength to our platform and our ticket, Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson felt humiliated during his vice presidency. Not only had he been Senate Majority Leader, he had been the master of the Senate, the most powerful majority leader in the history of the chamber, one that redefined the role.
Bobby Kennedy, you know, you hate to use words as a historian, like hatred. But hatred isn't too strong a word to describe the relationship between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. They hated each other. Robert Kennedy said of Lyndon Johnson after his brother was killed, he said he never would call Johnson president. So when he uses the word president, it's his brother. He said, "My president was a gentleman and a human being. This man is not. He's mean, bitter, vicious, and animal in many ways."
There are conflicting stories on the circumstances of how Kennedy chose Johnson to be his vice president. Whether or not JFK really wanted him on the ticket, whether or not RFK was aware of the decision. Fascinating questions that we could speculate on all day long, but for the purposes of this video, let's look at what we know and what it tells us about these larger-than-life figures. Jack Kennedy needed to win Texas, which had been taken by the Republicans during both of Eisenhower's bids for the presidency. And picking Texas's favorite son, one with a habit for finding votes in, let's just say, creative places, the Southern Bloc loved Lyndon Johnson and saw him as a perfect way to balance out the ticket headed by a young northern rich kid they didn't exactly think much of. LBJ had also been the most powerful Democrat in the country, a legislative force of nature famous for his ability to beg, bully, or flatter anyone into agreement with him. Putting him on the ticket would not only remove a majority leader capable of disrupting the Kennedy agenda and implementing his own, it would place him in a powerless office completely subservient to the ambitious young president. The master of the Senate would become a relic of Washington, left behind and forgotten in the trash heap of history. No single person worked harder to see John F. Kennedy elected president than his brother Bobby. The dream of his father and of both his older brothers had finally been accomplished, in large part because of his own efforts. But what would be his place in the new administration? He was the president's brother, which was undoubtedly a case of nepotism. He was only 35 years old, which would make him one of the youngest AGs in history. As many other things in the lives of the two brothers, the appointment had been set in motion by old Joe Kennedy. He felt that as president, Jack needed someone loyal from inside the family to look out for him in the backstabbing world of Washington politics, and someone who would give it to him straight, not caring about what he wanted to hear. Bobby had proven himself, both as Jack's attack dog and his protector. JFK was concerned at how the public would react to the obvious nepotism of the appointment. The soon-to-be president stood up to his father, but to no avail. The elder Kennedy told his son, "Your brother Bobby busted his ass for you. He gave you his lifeblood. You know it, and I know it. By God, he deserves to be Attorney General of the US. And by God, that's what he's going to be. Do you understand that?" The thing is, Bobby wasn't sure what he wanted. In a rare moment for him, he couldn't make up his mind. He wasn't interested in practicing law or going into business, but he was also ready to be his own man, not living in his brother's shadow. And he had the option to do essentially anything he pleased. Did he really want to continue his crusade, chasing bad men as he had in the Senate? But Bobby was a crusader and an investigator, traits that would serve him well as Attorney General. The job also gave him the independence he sought as head of the Justice Department, while also being able to remain a close political advisor to his brother. But Robert Kennedy had never actually tried a case in a court of law, a huge knock against his qualifications to be Attorney General. A great irony of this is that it took Lyndon Johnson, of all people, and his Senate connections to get Bobby confirmed. Once he took office, RFK had something to prove. He needed to excel in his new role to show the naysayers they were wrong. Bobby was a gifted political operative, one who moved swiftly in the shadows, away from the public eye. He did all of Jack's dirty work, and perhaps the most reprehensible of these actions was the wiretapping of Martin Luther King. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had been in the Kennedys' ears, sowing distrust about the civil rights leader, emphasizing his ties to former communists. JFK was pushing a civil rights bill, and they couldn't afford to have the face of that issue bogged down by controversy. But all that was found in the wiretaps was evidence of King's extramarital affairs, a subject that wasn't exactly foreign to the Kennedys. Following the wiretapping, Bobby would actually push much harder for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, but to no avail. This was a sign of the changing Bobby, one that started to embrace idealism and let go of some of his previous dogma. A Bobby Kennedy that became patient in areas where he had never been patient before, who listened when he had always spoke, and who became an ally of the man he had once surveilled. But the most telling experience from Robert Kennedy's time in his brother's administration comes from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jack Kennedy had committed a huge blunder straight out of the gate with the Bay of Pigs invasion, followed by Bobby's constant meddling in and sabotage of Cuba. Short-sighted decisions that riled up the Soviets. Never before had an attorney general been so involved in foreign policy.
Satisfaction with the new appointment was not unanimous. Even the most responsible newspapers expressed disappointment. But 4 years later, they admitted they were wrong. They would learn that the man who occupied the Attorney General's chair now was one who came early and stayed late.
Throughout his life, Robert Kennedy had been a ruthless, shrewd politician willing to do whatever it takes, however immoral, to reach victory. This can be hard to square with the Bobby that ran for the presidency, who sought to mend the deep divisions of the 1960s. The truth is, you can't understand RFK without putting these two sides of him together. One unusually warm November day at Hickory Hill, Robert Kennedy had been enjoying time with Ethel and some friends when they received a call from the direct White House line. Ethel didn't wish to disturb her husband during a rare moment of relaxation, but the caller insisted. It was J. Edgar Hoover, of all people, to break the news to the Attorney General. In a cold, unfeeling, monotone voice, the president, his brother, the center of his universe, to which he had completely devoted himself, had been shot.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
Bobby was blindsided, and Ethel quickly came to investigate her husband's apparent distress. Jack's been shot. It may be fatal. He knew how to handle a crisis and immediately sprung into frantic action, as he had often done in service of his brother. Today he was doing it instead in service of his family. After Joe Kennedy's stroke and Jack's preoccupation with the presidency, Bobby had assumed the role of patriarch. and today the role truly became his. Despite his own tidal wave of emotions he had always felt more deeply than anyone around him, he stayed strong, guiding both the Kennedy clan and the president's closest advisors through this difficult moment. Lyndon Johnson even paid Bobby a considerably callous phone call given the situation, seeking his approval to be immediately sworn in as president through his official function as Attorney General, not as the president's brother. A clear attempt to give Johnson the appearance of Kennedy family approval, planting the seeds for a new dimension of the rivalry that would define these two men for the rest of their lives. Kennedy would meet Air Force One, carrying his brother's body that evening at Andrews Air Force Base, barely acknowledging the man he so vehemently detested, who had now assumed his brother's office, putting all his attention instead onto his brother's widow. Bobby had comforted his sister-in-law before, at times where his brother had been insensitive and even cruel. It was him that came to her side after a horrible stillbirth, while Jack didn't bother to leave his yacht full of young women in the Mediterranean. This man who so often had been called ruthless, who so often had been ruthless, had been brutal, had deserved all these ugly characterizations, had also been kind, compassionate, and caring in moments when no one else could be, in moments that anyone would have expected and even excused the wrath he so often had exhibited. Robert Kennedy began his metamorphosis long before his brother was killed. But this event that shattered his reality and stripped back all the infinite complexities of his character would allow him to grow and change and take center stage. The third son, the forgotten son, the spare of the spare, who of which nothing was expected, but from whom so much had been given. A man whose genuine care for the downtrodden far outweighed that of the brother and president he so diligently served. A care and compassion that would grow exponentially in the few remaining years of his own life.
Robert Kennedy loved kids. At the time of his death, he was a father of 10 with an 11th on the way. Children were one of the only things that could lift his spirits during this darkest period in his life. His first public appearance since the funeral was at a Christmas party for a Washington orphanage. When he entered the room, the loud laughter and playing of the children suddenly stopped, as one young boy ran up to him and exclaimed, "Your brother's dead! Your brother's dead!" Immediately, the boy knew he had done something wrong and began to cry. Bobby simply picked up the child and told him, "That's all right, I have another brother." John Kennedy had been the center of his brother's life, the outlet for all of his ambitions. Even with him gone, Bobby's world still centered on Jack. He hung photos of him up in his office, started wearing some of Jack's old clothes, and often visited his grave. His grief was overpowering, but it was Kennedy family tradition to not show emotion. For months, he likely suffered from undiagnosed depression, a notion that Bobby himself scoffed at. Robert Kennedy had never been just the Attorney General. Not while Jack was alive, at least. But Jack was dead, and Lyndon Johnson was president. This man, as he called him, was now sitting in his brother's chair. The power dynamics and the strained relationship flipped on a dime by way of an assassin's bullet. No longer would the Attorney General have a voice in foreign policy as he had had with his brother. Lyndon Johnson reveled in torturing Bobby as Bobby had tortured him. RFK's staff had even gifted him a voodoo doll of the then vice president. Robert Kennedy stayed in the administration and urged his allies to do the same. "We must all stay in close touch and not let them pick us off one by one. My brother barely had a chance to get started, and there's so much more to be done. For the Negroes and the unemployed and school kids and everyone else who is not getting a decent break in our society, this is what counts. The new fellow doesn't get this. He knows all about politics and nothing about human beings." No sentence better sums up Kennedy's view of Johnson.
By no means did they want to work together, but they needed each other, at least for the moment. LBJ needed Bobby on his side to solidify him as JFK's proper successor. The sooner the Attorney General left, the more clear his disapproval of Johnson would be. And Robert Kennedy needed the new president because he still wanted to be in the world of politics, and felt it was his responsibility to keep working for those who supported and believed in his brother. Despite the mutual benefit of their limited partnership, RFK didn't even try to hide his contempt for Johnson. LBJ told his biographer, "I'd given 3 years of loyal service to Jack Kennedy. During all that time, I'd willingly stayed in the background. I knew that it was his presidency, not mine. And then Kennedy was killed, and I became custodian of his will. I became the president. But none of this seemed to register with Bobby Kennedy, who acted like he was custodian of the Kennedy dream, some kind of rightful heir to the throne. It didn't seem fair. I'd waited for my turn. Bobby should have waited for his." Johnson would always be paranoid about Robert Kennedy coming to retake his brother's legacy. During the 1964 Democratic Convention, LBJ relegated Bobby to the closing night speaking slot, just in case he tried to pull anything. There, Kennedy presented a film honoring his brother, along with a speech, in a moment that the public would come to see as his turning point, when he began to lift himself out of his grief and move forward.
I want to express my appreciation to you for the effort that you made on his behalf at the convention 4 years ago, the efforts that you made on his behalf for his election in November of 1960, and perhaps most importantly, the encouragement and the strength that you gave him after he was elected President of the United States.
In the coming months, the new Robert Kennedy would take shape. His long crusades against Castro and the mob lost their appeal. On a visit to a Catholic home for the aged, RFK spent a majority of his time with the terminally ill patients. Ben Bradley recalled, "I watched with tears in my eyes as the ruthless Bobby Kennedy stroked this unknown woman's hand and spoke to her in a near whisper." Bobby's professional focus also reflected a more human orientation. The chasing of bad men suddenly wasn't as rewarding anymore. He and Johnson worked brilliantly towards the passage of JFK's Civil Rights Act, where Robert Kennedy served as a reminder of the slain brother who never lived to see its passage. This was the tragedy of the Johnson-Kennedy relationship. Two remarkable politicians who could accomplish great things together, but who were unable to get past their own hatred for one another. Jack Kennedy's new frontier represented an idea, one that the administration often fell short of, but one who Robert Kennedy would dedicate his life to bringing about. Jack had been the academic in the family, the bookworm who loved to ponder life's questions and complexities. Robert Kennedy, with his black and white worldview, lacked his brother's meditative quality. He was headstrong and uncompromising about the things he believed in. Tragedy might come, but it had always fit inside of his preconceived notions about the world. But his brother's killing, the death of President Kennedy, seemed so random, so meaningless. His brother hadn't been a martyr for some great cause, yet he still lied in a grave. During this time, he started reading constantly. The Greeks, Thoreau, Shakespeare, expanding his horizons and trying to make sense of what had happened. The core of who Bobby Kennedy was still strong within him, but he had shifted in ways no one expected. With his brother gone and his father debilitated by a stroke, he finally came into his own. For the first time in his life, he was truly in charge of his own destiny and free to make his own decisions. For the first time in his life, he felt doubt. He felt conflicted about his worldview, about himself. Doubt that suddenly overpowered this man who had always been so certain. His newfound introspection allowed him to become more than what he had always been. Jack Kennedy had struggled with numerous health problems throughout his life, coming close to death many times before his tragic end. Even without his fatal trip to Dallas, Kennedy likely had a very limited amount of time on this earth. During his boyhood, his prolonged bouts with illness and time spent in a sickbed drove him to read constantly. Through these experiences, he became familiar with mortality, which further drove him to live life to the fullest and to do so with a sense of urgency. Urgency that Bobby was never able to relate to. Now the younger brother felt the weight of his own morality, seeing how quickly it could be taken away. But when others might have been paralyzed by it, he was determined to do everything he could during his lifetime because life could end at any moment. He felt more empathy for the less fortunate of the world, the minorities and the poor to which Robert's newfound suffering had been a regular occurrence. Suddenly, he felt a kinship with them. RFK was finding his new motivations, his reasons to push forward and keep fighting. But how would he bring his newfound convictions to life when getting convictions just didn't quite cut it anymore? He considered various different offices. He even considered taking a break from public life and fully dedicating himself to his studies. But Robert Kennedy could never leave the arena. He was growing rapidly out of his brother's shadow and out of who he had been in his brother's administration. The agenda he fought for now was his own, not his brother's. Bobby's politics had become far more radical than anything the cautious Jack Kennedy would have pursued. His newfound philosophy could be understood through words written by Camus. Perhaps we cannot prevent this world from being a world in which children are tortured, but we can reduce the number of tortured children. And if you don't help us, who else in the world can help us do this? For his entire political career, RFK had been a behind-the-scenes player, one who was hired and appointed, never elected, never subject to direct judgment by the public. A new arena in which his ruthlessness that still remained central to his character, even with his softened edges, could be a real liability. There was only one electoral office that made sense for Bobby Kennedy, and it was completely foreign to his nature, that of a United States Senator. RFK had the peculiar chance to pick whatever state he wanted to run in. He played around with Virginia or Maryland before settling on New York, a state well suited for Bobby's cosmopolitan image.
You know, as I was touring upstate, I kept seeing these signs saying, "Go back home." Carpetbagger, go home, and now here I am. You know, I had even had problems when I was upstate. People couldn't understand my accent. I explained it was Glen Cove and Long Island. They don't know what you're saying. You say the cop went down the path, and they don't know what that means.
In reality, he lived in Virginia, and charges of carpetbagger, much like the earlier charges of nepotism, were very accurate.
The former Attorney General of the United States and candidate for the United States Senate from New York, Robert F. Kennedy.
But here he was, the first time in his life as a political candidate, one very much still burdened by grief, which would make him more sympathetic to New York voters. He had a lot to learn. This wasn't the confident, headstrong Bobby that was running. Suddenly, he seemed shy, reserved, and even scared. Robert Francis Kennedy, who had gotten his brother elected to the nation's highest office, was painfully uncomfortable with being a candidate. Bobby is often lumped in with the Kennedy charisma, something he definitely developed his own version of, but he had also had his fair share of awkward stumbles beforehand. Watching clips from that Senate race, you can see him finding his footing in real time, particularly in clips from a forum where he took questions from students at Columbia University.
President Kennedy's favorite quote was really from Dante, that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in time of moral crisis preserve their neutrality. So if all of us, whether it's in the field of civil rights or housing or whether it's in Vietnam or whatever it is, just hang back and say this is a problem of somebody else. If we're going to permit what's going on in Harlem now, of those young children to grow up uneducated and untrained and dissatisfied with life and dissatisfied with their future and feeling that there is nothing in this system, then we're going to be in difficulty. Even if we look at this selfishly, we're going to be in difficulty. The whole system's going to be in difficulty. Sophocles said one time, well, what joy is there in the day that follows day, some swift, some slow, with death the only goal. And really that's what many of our fellow citizens, whether they're in Appalachia or whether they're in Harlem, or whether they're the white children that live in some of these other areas where there's no future, or even our elderly people over the age of 65 who feel that there's not any future for them, that all they're going to do is die and get sick and have to take a pauper's oath. These, I think, are our responsibilities. These are your responsibilities, just as they are mine. Now, I hope that I win as the United States Senator, but even if I don't, I think that for all of us, that we have an obligation. We have a responsibility. If we don't do it, then nobody's going to do it. And if educated people don't do it, then nobody's going to do it. The people that are going to make the difference for this country and for the world are educated people. And we have a special, not only responsibility, but a special opportunity to make a difference in the world and make a difference for this country. And that's really what I come to say to you. I think of what Archimedes said, and perhaps it's a little explaining the lever. And he said, show me where I can stand and I can move the world. And I think that we can. I think that we started it 3.5 years ago, and I think we can continue it. And I don't think it's just a question of political belief, but I think that we can make a difference. And so, thank you.
He was, of course, aided by having his brother's name, as nostalgic New York voters cast their ballots with the fallen president in mind. But Bobby certainly worked for his victory, perhaps even to counteract that image, just as he had worked so hard as a Senate lawyer and as Attorney General. Worked to prove he deserved the job he had been given through his family connections. Bobby was never going to be a Senate man like Ted. He didn't have the patience to slowly learn the complex rules of the upper chamber, to backslap and schmooze with the old Senate bulls. Like Jack, Bobby was a natural executive. Not only had he been Attorney General, he had been his brother's closest advisor. Toward the end of Jack's life, the brothers had gotten closer and closer, with JFK's presidency becoming much more of a partnership between the two. Another great contradiction of Robert Kennedy is of him both as a dreamer and as a realist.
Not because I think that if I'm elected President of the United States, poverty will disappear, or illiteracy will no longer be with us, or that the war in Vietnam will suddenly end. I don't promise any of those things. But I do promise to you here in Portland and the state of Oregon that I will talk about the issues with candor and with truth. I do believe that the American people are generous and compassionate, and I believe that we can do much better than we've done over the period of the last few years.
The Vietnam War is a subject far too complex for me to go in depth on in this already massive video. But Johnson's hawkishness in his pursuit of the war was reflective of the popular Cold War attitudes among Democrats at the time, including that of the Kennedy brothers during Jack's administration. Robert Kennedy had been a Cold Warrior through and through, and he had originally supported American involvement in the conflict. His changing opinions on the war are reflective about his changing opinions on politics in general. Vietnam was tearing the country apart. Lyndon Johnson's leadership was failing, and his presidency was spiraling. Kennedy felt that the nation couldn't survive another 4 years under the current president. But challenging an incumbent would almost certainly fail, and a divided Democratic Party was much more likely to give way to Richard Nixon in the fall. RFK insisted to the public that he was in fact not running as late as January 1968. Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy was waging a primary campaign against Johnson, representing the voice of the doves who sought to reduce American involvement in Vietnam. McCarthy overperformed in the New Hampshire primary with 41.9% of the vote, an impressive showing against a sitting president. Bobby could never resist a crusade, and this event was the deciding factor for him to get in the race, declaring his candidacy just 4 days later. It was official. Robert Kennedy was running for president. The political genius who preferred to operate in the shadows had changed so significantly that he was now an insurgent candidate for the presidency. A common criticism of RFK accuses him of being an opportunist, unwilling to challenge the sitting president as McCarthy had until he was assured his candidacy would be more viable, which from my perspective is perfectly valid. But this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had agonized over it for months, and his late entry would put him at a significant disadvantage in building a proper campaign organization. Bobby's campaign would officially launch on March 16th, in the same Senate caucus room where his brother had launched his.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies.
I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can.
Though their speeches were similar, America was different, and so was Bobby. The world was a more fractured and complicated place than it had been when Jack Kennedy painted the broad strokes of the new frontier. The new Kennedy campaign would push a message of peace in Vietnam that they saw as unachievable under Johnson. RFK would serve as a complete foil to the increasingly unpopular president he had so despised. Little did they know what would happen just 2 weeks later.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Suddenly, Lyndon Johnson, the nemesis who had undeservedly picked up his slain brother's mantle, had defied all expectations and precedent in not seeking another term. The entire presidential race changed in an instant. Just 4 days later, before the campaign or the country could find their footing, more news broke. Martin Luther King had been assassinated, a further indication of just how chaotic of a year 1968 would be. Robert Kennedy had a complex legacy on civil rights. During the 1960 campaign, he and his brother had urged Georgia officials to release King from jail, a decision that helped their performance among Black Americans. This seemingly contradicts the wiretapping he would do shortly after. But contradictions like these can be found all throughout Bobby's life. Robert Kennedy started out having a sympathetic, if at times skeptical and condescending attitude towards civil rights, even wiretapping MLK. But following his brother's killing, he would move much closer to King's politics, finding common cause with the civil rights leader. After King's tragic death, RFK delivered the most memorable speech eulogizing the fallen icon.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are Black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, Black people amongst Blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand, compassion, and love.
And how he may have had the unique ability to unite the country at one of its most divisive moments. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm only going to go through the broad strokes of the presidential campaign, which, I guess, brings us to the inevitable end. It's funny, as you learn more and more about history, your perspectives shift and change, but there's no changing the fundamental surface-level information you knew beforehand. If anything, the additional context can make it even more tragic. On June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy gave a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, following his victory in the California primary.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
There are photos of what followed, but I'm not going to include them for obvious reasons. Kennedy went to exit through the ballroom, but was redirected towards the back entrance. As he passed through the kitchen, all of a sudden, various shots were fired. Kennedy fell to the floor, first asking if everyone was all right. He then said, "Everything's going to be okay." A young busboy placed a rosary in his hand as there was a light smile on his face. His wife Ethel would quickly run up and join him. His last words were, Don't lift me up," as he lost consciousness. In Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon, the primary source for this video, author Larry Tye writes that at the end of his life, Robert Kennedy was a builder of bridges between islands of blacks, browns, and blue-collar whites, between terrified parents and estranged youths, and between the establishment he'd grown up in and the new politics he heralded. At age 42, he was on his way to becoming the tough liberal, or perhaps tender conservative, who might have stitched back together a divided land and whose vision seems at least as resonant in today's polarized America.
Thus, I think our destiny is to rebuild America, the destiny of this generation of Americans, to change the face of this nation, to deal with our problems, to talk about our divisions with candor and truth, to talk about what separates us and what divides us and what's good about the United States and what we can do about it. That's what I ask of you, to make your voices heard, not just in protest, not just being against, but that this country will have a new face. George Bernard Shaw once said, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" And I ask you to join me. Thank you.
The era that followed the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy was characterized as the fall of liberalism, the end of the New Deal consensus that had governed the United States since the Roosevelt administration. Conservatism would become the dominant ideology in America, a movement that was set in motion long before Bobby's death. An ideological shift that may well have still occurred even if he had survived, but one whose flames he may have been uniquely suited to cool. Richard Nixon had an incredible talent for playing on people's fears, appealing to what he called the silent majority of white working-class voters that felt left behind by the progress of the 1960s. With great social change came great social backlash that brought about a realignment of coalitions we still live within today. Robert Kennedy would have faced numerous challenges as president. He may even have lost the Democratic nomination to Hubert Humphrey. Any Democrat coming after Lyndon Johnson would be at a significant disadvantage. He would have likely struggled with Congress the same way that his brother had, lacking the legislative prowess of LBJ. He would also have struggled with Vietnam and white backlash to civil rights. It's easy to romanticize figures like Robert Kennedy, men of great promise that were struck down before they could ever come to power. But Kennedy was there during one of the great crossroads of American history, offering hope to the hopeless. Between poverty, civil rights, and Vietnam, issues that were tearing the country apart. His ability to find hope in these moments is a sentiment I feel we need more of today. In reality, there's no way to know if Bobby Kennedy would have been the greatest president we never had. But that question, that possibility, will always be worth considering. Richard Nixon is one of the most fascinating presidents in American history.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The 37th President of the United States was a man of many talents and contradictions. A brilliant statesman plagued by insecurity and paranoia, Tricky Dick might be the closest we've ever come to a Shakespearean president. Nixon's triumph and ultimate downfall are well documented, but in this video I wanted to discuss what Nixon thought of some of the other presidents that he encountered during his lifetime. One of my biggest goals on this channel is to humanize history, to take these larger-than-life figures and to try to understand them as they actually were. What does this man with his unique perspective have to say about his fellow presidents and the presidency and power overall?
The major strength that President Eisenhower brought to the handling of crisis was the fact that he had been through great crises, and so everything was kept in perspective. After all, when he made the decision with regard to the landing in Normandy, the fate of not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people were involved, and he knew there would be thousands of casualties as a result. After going through that, then when he had to consider matters important as they were, as Kimoimatsu or the others that came before him while he was president, he could keep it in perspective. He was always the coolest man in the room as a result.
Richard Nixon served as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president from 1953 to 1961. During the 1952 presidential election, Nixon was accused of having a secret fund provided by businessmen from his home state of California. Eisenhower deeply valued political honesty, and most historians agree that he was ready to kick Nixon off the ticket over these charges. Nixon was able to escape the scandal by addressing it with his now famous Checkers speech.
One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something a gift after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat in the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Eisenhower's personal notes from after the speech indicate that it gave him a new admiration for Nixon's political talent.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Nixon saw the vice presidency as a job completely in service of the president. This fit well with Eisenhower's military background, as he was used to complete subordination. The level of policy disagreement between the two is debated by biographers, but one thing is clear: Nixon was Eisenhower's loyal soldier, his eyes and ears all over the globe, and a useful tool to rally the right wing and bolster Eisenhower's anti-communist credentials.
Vice President Richard Nixon badly injured his knee when a car door accidentally slammed on it. President Eisenhower came to commiserate with him in the hospital. It was a piece of bad luck.
While the president could present himself as above the fray, his vice president became the face of partisan Republican politics. This earned him admiration from Republicans and animosity from Democrats that would define the rest of his political career. Eisenhower may have had some concerns about Nixon being the top of the ticket during the 1960 election, but they were overshadowed by his fears of a John F. Kennedy presidency. In 1960, Eisenhower campaigned for Nixon in a very limited capacity due to the president's health issues and the vice president's desire to cement himself as his own man. During a press conference, Eisenhower was asked what major ideas from Nixon he had adopted while president, to which Eisenhower replied,
"If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember, because..."
He of course didn't mean to insult his VP, but the damage was done, and the Kennedy camp was going to use it to their advantage.
President Eisenhower could not remember, but the voters will remember. For real leadership in the 60s, help elect Senator John F. Kennedy president.
As we all know, Nixon would go on to lose that election, but his time would come soon enough. These two would come to know each other not only as president and vice president, but also as members of the same family. Eisenhower's grandson David married Nixon's daughter Julie in 1968, taking the political marriage of these two presidents to a whole other level.
I think that John Kennedy, despite all of the talk, which I understand about his charisma and the rest, that John Kennedy was a very private person. When I first met him as a congressman, he's essentially quite shy, quite withdrawn. He's studious, intellectual.
While we tend to think of them as opposing figures, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy had as many similarities as they had differences. Both men served in the Pacific Theater during World War II before being elected to the House, Senate, and eventually the presidency. Where they differed, of course, was in their upbringing. Kennedy was part of a wealthy and powerful political family, growing up about as fortunate as any American possibly could in those days. Nixon, on the other hand, was born to a poor Quaker family in Southern California that had to fight to survive. JFK went to his father's alma mater, Harvard, while Nixon had to forego an Ivy League education in favor of going to a local college in order to help his parents financially. Let's put ourselves in Nixon's shoes for a moment. You clawed your way out of the dirt. You worked your entire life to go from rags to riches and eventually reach the heights of political power, only to have some rich boy steal it from you using daddy's money. Nixon's view of Kennedy is one that came to be defined by envy and bitterness, but before facing off for the presidency, the two were actually quite friendly. Though their 1960 presidential debate is by far the most well-known, the two men had actually debated each other previously in 1947. Invited to the venue as the two congressional freshmen with the brightest futures, Nixon and Kennedy debated the merits of the Taft-Hartley Act. That night, these two future leaders of the free world shared a bunk bed, and despite all their differences, stayed up for hours just talking to each other.
He was very intelligent. He was very personable. However, I sensed that he was very shy, frankly, as I was. I rather thought that we were alike in that respect. We were very different in many ways. But he had a very great sense of privacy. I think that's one of the reasons perhaps we hit it off rather well. I remember one night, for example, that Eunice Kennedy, his older sister, who was not married then, had a dinner at her house where he was there and I was there and a few of the other young members of Congress. And we talked far, far into the night, not incidentally about domestic issues where we would totally disagree, in many cases like on Taft-Hartley, but about foreign policy where Kennedy and I saw the world pretty much alike.
The two would go on to have a good working relationship throughout the 50s, but the 1960 election would be a brutal one filled with personal attacks. Not only would Nixon be facing Jack Kennedy, but the entire Kennedy machine, including brother and campaign manager Bobby Kennedy, who came close to running his own presidential election against Nixon in '68. Here, Nixon experienced RFK's ruthlessness and political passion firsthand. A now famous ad from that election cycle features a photo of Nixon with text that says, "Would you buy a used car from this man?" implying that Nixon was sleazy and untrustworthy. Kennedy would ultimately win in what was one of the closest elections in American history. Nixon believed, with pretty substantial evidence, that the Kennedys had used their massive family fortune to steal the election in Illinois and Texas, though he ultimately conceded. On November 22nd, 1963, Jack Kennedy was frozen in time. Regardless of what incredible achievements he had in life, he would forever be known by how his life ended. There was a quote Kennedy was fond of, which he used in a letter discussing the premature death of his older brother Joe Jr. He loved his youth, and his youth has become eternal. Ironically enough, this would come to define Jack, forever idealized by the American people, while Nixon, on the other hand, would be forever defined by Watergate and its political fallout. Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy are both political figures defined by one moment. Both were flawed men with complex legacies, but the tone of how each of them is remembered was set primarily by one thing. John F. Kennedy would come to embody American idealism. Those Camelot years came to a screeching halt at the end of an assassin's bullet and gave way to the dark, jaded politics of the 60s and 70s that Nixon would come to embody. Nixon would grow jealous and bitter not only over the Kennedy wealth and the result of the 1960 election, but the Kennedy legacy in contrast to his own. For the rest of his political life, Nixon would be afraid of a Kennedy coming back to take everything he had worked so hard for. Whether that be Bobby, who would likely have been Nixon's opponent in 1968 had it not been for yet another assassin's bullet, or even their younger brother Ted, who Nixon saw as the strongest politician out of the three.
Looking at the Kennedys, I make an interesting comparison. First, Edward Kennedy was the best politician of the three. He is the best politician. He's gregarious. He loves it. He's warm. John Kennedy, on the other hand, was quite a shy person, really. It was not easy for him to get out and shake hands and the rest. He did it very well. It wasn't easy for him. He was a quite private person. I would say that Bobby Kennedy, on the other hand, well, I would compare him, as Alice Longworth used to, as he was like a 17th century Jesuit priest, passionate, one who brooked no opposition and so forth, very intelligent and so forth.
When Nixon first heard about the Kennedy assassination, he had a very emotional reaction.
President Kennedy yesterday wrote the final and greatest chapter in his profile of courage. Today, millions of people throughout the world are trying to find words adequate to express their grief and their sympathy to his family. The greatest tribute we could all pay to his memory would be in our everyday lives to do everything we possibly can to reduce the hatred that drives men to such terrible deeds.
Not only was he mourning a president and former friend, he was pondering the fact that it could have been him in that motorcade instead. In many ways, Nixon and Kennedy led parallel lives, so similar yet painfully different. But is there a man whose story bears even closer to Nixon's? Another ambitious kid from a poor family that would reach the heights of political power only to leave the presidency defeated and humiliated? Yes, there is, and his name is Lyndon Johnson.
A new page of American history is inscribed in the nation's capital as President Lyndon Baines Johnson leaves the White House to take the oath for his first full term as 36th President of the United States.
Both Johnson and Nixon had sought the presidency in 1960 before ultimately losing to the charismatic young Kennedy. Both men went into their own forms of exile during the JFK years, feeling that their political careers may have been over, and both men came back to win giant electoral victories and fight the war in Vietnam before their respective political downfalls.
Johnson would have been much better had he been Johnson. I hear these days, for example, some of the enthusiastic, sincere, ultra-conservative supporters of Reagan say, let Reagan be Reagan. Well, the best advice Johnson could have had, let Johnson be Johnson, rather than trying to pander to his liberal critics. If Johnson had been Johnson, he would not have had gradual escalation of the war in Vietnam. I think he would have done something far more dramatic and decisive, as Johnson was not a weak man. And in that case, his weakness, I think, led to his downfall.
The first significant meeting between the 36th and 37th presidents of the United States came when Vice President Nixon visited Senate Majority Leader Johnson in the hospital following his 1955 heart attack. Nixon just meant to stop by, but he ended up talking to LBJ for hours. While the two men never became close personal friends, there was a relationship that formed that day. As VP and Senate President during LBJ's masterful time as Majority Leader, Nixon was able to see Johnson's political talent firsthand. The Senate had long been a stubborn, unmovable institution, and Johnson was able to bend it to his will. Needless to say, Nixon was impressed.
There's no question in my mind that in this century, the three greatest politicians, active politicians, were Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. Nobody else of the presidents was in their league.
During the Johnson administration, the relationship became more adversarial as Nixon cemented himself as the opposition. Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson had drastically different views of domestic politics, and a Nixon administration would be tasked with dismantling Johnson's Great Society programs. Despite these differences, both men were good friends with the Reverend Billy Graham and would use him to pass along messages to each other. In these notes, Nixon referred to Johnson as the hardest working president in 140 years.
I think maybe we can get through LBJ in that period.
Oh yes, I can do that.
Okay.
You know, there's this terrible book out on him. It's a terrible book.
Oh, I know it by George Reedy. Did you read? Is it Reedy's book?
No.
Oh no, this new
Carroll
book. Yeah.
It gets a rave review from Clifford Fadiman in Book of the Month. Unbelievable.
Stand by.
Shit, it makes him feel like a goddamn animal.
Quiet.
Of course he was.
During his retirement, Johnson watched his successor's presidency from afar, though the two communicated periodically. The truth is that the presidency is a unique position, and consulting one of the few human beings who have been in that position will probably bring valuable insight. Like Nixon, Johnson had been a Kennedy rival who feared RFK coming back to finish what his brother had started. But, like I mentioned earlier, assassin's bullet. A large part of the commonality in Nixon and Johnson's legacies comes from simply not being JFK. They were left to make difficult decisions on issues like Vietnam that Kennedy himself would have had to make if he had survived. It's a cliche at this point to say that we would have a much more negative perception of Kennedy if he had lived, but that's likely true, and the other two presidents from the 1960s can attest to that.
Vice President Ford this morning, as he left his home to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
As Richard Nixon's political fate was sealed with revelations of the Watergate scandal and his eventual resignation, there was a lot more in jeopardy than just the former president's legacy. The question of how Nixon's crimes would be addressed in court was weighing heavily on a nation that felt jaded and cynical. But it would be Nixon's own successor who saved him by granting the former president a full and complete pardon. Gerald Ford never wanted to be president. He spent his entire career working to become Speaker of the House. Ford only assumed the number 2 slot after Vice President Spiro Agnew had to resign because of a political scandal.
Now, going from vice president to president is a different change, because you went from a job as vice president where you had a lot of things that had to be done, but you weren't the final answer. And of course, going to the job as chief executive, the whole world became quite different.
As we all know, Ford would replace Nixon as commander-in-chief despite never being elected to a national party ticket.
When a limousine can parade openly through the streets of Dallas, there's a change that's come over America.
When he tried to win the presidency in his own right in 1976, he lost to Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, making him the only president in American history to not have been elected to a national ticket.
I'm Gerald Ford, and you're not.
It's impossible to separate Ford's electoral loss from the political backlash to Watergate and Ford's pardoning of Nixon. Despite the decision being politically unpopular, the president felt that it was the best thing for the country.
I had a full platter of problems involving 230 million American people. Then I went to a press conference, my first press conference, and I thought I would be asked questions about the economy, about international affairs. 90% of those questions were from the White House press. What are you going to do about Mr. Nixon's tapes, Mr. Nixon's papers? And as I walked back to the Oval Office, I said to myself, I got to get rid of that problem.
But what about the personal relationship between these two men? Could Ford's feelings toward his predecessor have affected his decision at all?
The man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
While Gerald Ford was not Richard Nixon's first pick for VP, their friendship would be the most significant one that Nixon had with another president, to the extent that Ford, when talking about Nixon, said, "I was his only real friend."
And you went to his funeral.
I went to his funeral along with others.
And your feelings?
Yes, he was a longtime friend who made a very stupid mistake. So I have to look at the overall, which I think was a good record, and concede that everybody's human and you can make mistakes that are very unfortunate and regrettable.
The Nixon-Ford relationship started long before these two joined forces in the White House. For decades, the two had corresponded with a much greater sense of camaraderie than can be found in most of Nixon's conversations. Prior to Ford assuming the vice presidency, Nixon begged the then House Minority Leader to rally the troops in Congress amidst the growing Watergate scandal. As we all know, Ford would replace Nixon as president despite never being elected by the American people. When Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, the Republican Party suffered greatly. The fallout from Watergate and Ford's pardoning of Nixon led to Ford's defeat against Jimmy Carter in 1976. But before we knew it, a new figure would rise and define the Republican Party for decades to come. But what if he wasn't actually a new figure?
Have your views changed substantially in any regard since the 1964 campaign?
No, as a matter of fact, my views haven't changed an awful lot since I was a Democrat. I believed then that anything, whether it came from labor, management, or government, that imposed unfairly on the individual or the freedom of the individual was tyranny and should be opposed.
Reagan was 69 years old when he was elected, making him the oldest American president in history up to that point. He had sought the Republican nomination himself in '68 and even challenged Ford for the top spot in '76.
Ronald Reagan.
Intelligent, strong, much younger than his years would indicate, and his appearance, vigorous. And in spite of the media, to a certain extent, some of it painting him as being a lightweight and a kook, a very reasonable, responsible man.
You have no unfortunately to say about him. You have nothing on the debit side about him.
No, he hasn't been president yet.
Reagan had served as governor of California from 1967 to 1975, meaning he was a major political figure for the entire duration of Nixon's presidency.
If only we could hear the conversations between them. That's the goofiest thing I've ever done. Richard Nixon was a deeply paranoid man, so logically he had a secret voice-activated recording system installed in the White House. This has led to countless conversations that are fascinating, to say the least.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did. Yeah. To see those monkeys from those African countries. Damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Nixon, who is famously a pretty strange person, had some interesting observations about the great communicator. In a 1972 conversation with White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Nixon started discussing two governors who had run against him for the 1968 Republican nomination. "Reagan is not one that wears well," says Nixon, to which Haldeman replies, "I know. On a personal basis, Rockefeller is a pretty nice guy. Reagan on a personal basis is terrible. He just isn't pleasant to be around." "No, he isn't," Haldeman replied. "Maybe he's different with others." To which Haldeman says, No, he's just an uncomfortable man to be around. Strange. Of course, this conversation happened in 1972, long before Reagan ever became president, and it's possible that Nixon's thoughts on Reagan actually did change and develop over the years, but I'll leave that up to your personal interpretation.
I'm obsessed with historical overlaps. I think that seeing two figures from completely different political eras together can add a lot of context to our history. As much as we associate a historical figure with the era in which they came to prominence, there's still the rest of their life to account for. The setting is 1980s New York City, where one former and one future president from different political eras are about to meet up: Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Not only did Trump and Nixon meet each other, they seem to have had a surprising friendship. These two men, one in his 30s and one in his 70s, actually became pen pals. Nixon wrote to the young businessman, "I think that you are one of this country's great men, and it was an honor to spend an evening with you." The two shared a general distrust of the media, and some of Nixon's statements even sound reminiscent of Trump's rhetoric today.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
In 1990, the former president wrote Trump a letter that read, "Dear Donald, I know nothing about the intricacies of your business empire, but the massive media attack on you puts me in your corner."
After First Lady Pat Nixon saw Trump's appearance on a late-night talk show, Nixon wrote to Trump once again saying, "As you can imagine, she's an expert on politics, and she predicts that whenever you decide to run for office, you will be a winner."
You've said, though, that if you did run for president, you believe you'd win.
Well, I don't know. I think I'd win. I tell you what, I wouldn't go in to lose. I've never gone in to lose in my life.
The last letter exchanged between the two came in 1993 when Trump wrote Nixon a happy birthday message saying, "You are a great man, and I have had and always will the most utmost respect and admiration for you. I am proud of you." This one is weird, man. It messes with my brain a little bit, if I'm being honest.
If I had a penny for every time that Richard Nixon knew a 30-year-old man who would go on to run for the presidency in his 70s before facing a rematch election 4 years later, I would have 2 pennies. Yes, it's true, Richard Nixon also knew our current president, Joe Biden.
The boyish-looking father of 3 young children was celebrating his 30th birthday. That makes him just old enough to be a United States Senator, 30 being the minimum age prescribed by the Constitution. If he stays in the Senate till the end of this century, he'll be 57, the average age of senators now.
Joe Biden's first wife, Nyla Hunter, and their infant daughter would pass away after a 1972 car accident. Then President Richard Nixon called the young senator to give him his condolences.
Yes, please.
Could you get the new senator from Delaware, Mr. Biden, on the phone, please?
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you? Senator, I know this is a very tragic day for you, but I wanted you to know that all of us here at the White House were thinking about you and praying for you, and also for your 2 children. And appreciate that very much. We know that I understand you were on the Hill at the time, and your wife was just driving by herself.
Yes.
But in any event, I mean, looking at it as you must in terms of the future, because you have the great fortune of being young. I remember I was 2 years older than you and I went to the house. But the main point is you can remember that she was there when you won a great victory, and you enjoyed it together, and now I'm sure that she'll be watching you from now on. Good luck to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Okay.
For your call. I appreciate it.
It's kind of surreal to think about the current president of the United States being elected to national office 50 years ago and talking to a president so associated with a bygone era. Richard Nixon is an odd person, to say the least, but the sheer amount of people that he met throughout his storied life makes him a very interesting person to study. I didn't even get to cover all of the different presidents that Nixon met, only the ones that were more interesting to me. As this video comes to a close, I wanted to reflect a little bit on Nixon himself and why I decided to make this video. I've always found Nixon very interesting, and his interviews about history and his contemporaries are some of the most insightful that I've ever seen about American politics. Richard Nixon was in a very strange position in our history as he continued to live on for 2 decades after being ousted from the presidency. The unique ending of his administration also gave him a very unique post-presidency. I've never heard another president speak so clearly and give so much insight into what the presidency was actually like. In many ways, Richard Nixon embodies the 20th century more than almost any other individual. From being born dirt poor on a farm to fighting in World War II and eventually becoming President of the United States, the highest office in all the land.
I know a lot of people, and I can understand it, say, gee whiz, it just isn't fair, for an individual to get off with a pardon simply because he happens to have been president. And when another individual goes to trial and maybe has to serve a prison sentence for it, I can understand how they feel. I can only say that no one in the world, no one in our history could know how I felt. No one could know how it feels to resign the presidency of the United States. Is that punishment enough? Oh, probably not. But whether it is or isn't, as I have said earlier in our interview, we have to live with not only the past, but for the future. And I don't know what the future brings, but whatever it brings, I'll still be fighting.
Richard Nixon has one of the most remarkable American stories ever told. A real-life Shakespearean tragedy where a great man goes against the odds and rises above the circumstances of his birth, reaching the heights of power in society only to fall victim to the same tendencies that got him there in the first place. He was in many ways a brilliant man, but one who couldn't see past the suffering and ridicule of his early life. A rags to riches story of resilience and fortitude that culminated in its protagonist being written in the history books as one of the great cartoon villains. I think that Richard Nixon is one of the most fascinating human beings that's ever walked this earth. And I've spent hours and hours reading and watching his interviews, trying to understand him. And the more that I've learned, the more I feel we need to look towards his youth. In this video, I want to take a look back at Nixon's early life, the struggle, the loss, and the triumph that shaped this peculiar man. The grocer's boy turned leader of the free world, who ultimately fell victim to his own personal demons and paranoia.
President Richard Nixon, only months after landslide re-election, finds himself haunted by a question that will not go away.
I was born in a house my father built. Those are the opening words of Richard Nixon's memoirs, and what powerful words they are. More akin to literature and legend than simple autobiography. A turn-of-the-century version of Lincoln's log cabin. It tells you everything Nixon wants you to know about him. The mythology behind this larger-than-life man. When telling the tale of Richard Nixon, you can forgive yourself for catching a gleam of destiny. The white clapboard house, built by Frank Nixon over a century ago, still stands today, surrounded by the decadence and prestige of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Who would have thought? Dick Nixon, the poor little grocer's boy, President of the United States. That house is a great allegory for Nixon himself, forged in poverty with a strong foundation, later surrounded by all the honors and prestige of the American presidency, yet still the same at its core. Frank Nixon built that house on land he intended to turn into a lemon grove, but the soil and the climate wasn't right for it. Later in life, Nixon would describe his parents as polar opposites. His father was a loud, boisterous, short-tempered man, while his mother was a true Quaker, calm, measured, and intelligent. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. Nixon would reflect on his childhood as one of mainly economic strain, with a stable home life and 2 good parents, which wasn't the reality. Frank Nixon was a deeply angry man who failed at almost everything he ever pursued. His anger created greater hardship for his young son than their perilous financial situation ever could. Nixon's need to erase painful parts of his own personal story are reflective of deep-seated aspects of his character. Looking at Hannah Nixon, you can see many of the same features that would later be mocked and exaggerated by countless cartoonists after her son's monumental rise and fall. The dark, heavy eyebrows and the button nose that curves upwards. Hannah was a devoted mother, but not a very warm one.
My mother, as a matter of fact, taught me to read before I ever went to school. And as a result, I skipped one of the early grades, I think the 2nd grade. And also, she influenced me greatly in the whole area of music because she could play the piano. She wasn't, of course, accomplished like my Aunt Jane or my Uncle Griffith. She was not a teacher, but her influence in those early years was enormous in that respect.
The young Nixon strived for success, excelling both academically and musically. As a child, he learned to play music and recite beautiful poems. He had little talent on the football field, but he was a fighter, and his difficulties in the sport only made him more dedicated to succeeding on the field. One of the most revealing relics of Nixon's early life is a letter he wrote at age 10 from the perspective of himself as a dog. "My dear master, the 2 boys that you left with me are very bad to me. Their dog Jim is very old and he will never talk or play with me. One Saturday, the boys went hunting. Jim and myself went with them. While going through the woods, one of the boys tripped and fell on me. I lost my temper and bit him. He kicked me in the side and we started on. While we were walking, I saw a black round thing in a tree. I hit it with my paw. A swarm of black thing came out of it. I felt pain all over. I started to run, and as both my eyes were swelled shut, I fell into a pond. When I got home, I was very sore. I wish you would come home right now. Your good dog, Richard." In this letter, a disgruntled young boy paints himself as the left-behind victim of a deeply cruel world. A parallel to this incident can be found in Nixon's courting of his future wife, Pat Ryan, where he would drive her to dates with other men and pick her up afterwards, just so she would keep him around. Hannah named all 5 of her boys after English kings. When Nixon was 12, his younger brother Arthur, the baby of the family, passed away after a short battle with meningitis at only 7 years old. Nixon would eulogize his younger brother in a beautiful essay he wrote in school.
Well, it isn't great literature, but perhaps it indicates how that particular event affected all of us. I was describing him. I remember how his eyes changed from their original baby blue to an almost black shade, and how his hair, blonde at first, became dark brown, and how his mouth, toothless for 5 months, was filled with tiny white teeth, which, by the way, were exceedingly sharp when applied on soft fingers or toes which happened to get within their reach, and how those little coherent, incoherent sounds of his finally developed into words and then into sentences, how he learned to roll over and then to crawl and finally to walk. Although I do not remember many incidents connected with my brother's early childhood, there were were some which made a clear imprint on my mind. There was one time when he was asked to be a ring bearer at a wedding. I remember how my mother had to work with him for hours to get him to do it because he disliked walking with a little flower girl. Another time when he's about 5 years old, he showed the world that he was a man by getting some cigarettes out of our store and secretly smoking them back of the house. Unfortunately for him, one of our gossipy neighbors happened to see him, and she promptly informed my mother. I have disliked that neighbor from that time. And again, I shall never forget how he disliked wearing sticky, woolly suits. As soon as he was able to read, he used to search the mail order catalogs for suits which weren't sticky. There's a grave now out in the hills, but like the picture, it contains only the bodily image of my brother. And so when I'm tired and worried and I'm almost ready to quit trying to live as I should, I look up, I see the picture of a little boy with sparkling eyes and curly hair. I remember the childlike prayer. I pray that it may prove true for me as I did for my brother Arthur.
Harold, the oldest of the Nixon brothers, would suffer various health problems attributed to tuberculosis throughout his time in high school. Him and Hannah moved out to a special care facility in Arizona where he could receive better medical attention, and where Hannah worked treating other patients to pay the bills.
Though he fought for a long time, Harold Nixon would ultimately succumb to his disease in 1933 at only 23 years old.
Nixon dismisses psychohistorical analyses of his personality, which often delve into his childhood, as we're doing in this video.
But the loss of two brothers to tuberculosis and the absence of the mother who was caring for them is sure to have had an effect.
Hannah Nixon would say about her boy, "Richard always seemed to need me more than the 4 other sons did." In his final speech to his White House staff prior to his resignation, Nixon, at his most vulnerable, reflects on his parents in a Shakespearean scene.
Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint.
This man who came from nothing and achieved everything only to lose it. There at his most emotional moment. Rarely do you see such vulnerability in a leader, let alone a president. The studious Nixon placed 3rd in his high school class, even earning a scholarship to Harvard. This could have been it. Nixon's ticket to success, away into the Eastern establishment he would later resent so deeply. But his family's precarious financial situation meant that Nixon couldn't leave home. They needed him to stay and help out at the store. Nixon had to attend the same small Quaker school that his mother had started at, Whittier College. Here, Nixon kept up his relentless pace, taking part in student government, debate, theater, football, and even the Glee Club. The college Nixon grew more self-assured, but he couldn't let go of the spiteful nature that drove him. It was the height of the Great Depression, and many Whittier students, including Nixon, were struggling with their finances. There were those on campus that looked down on the grocer's boy, who rose at 3:30 in the morning to drive to Los Angeles to buy produce for the Nixon market before heading off to class, and who would not relent in football no matter how often his lack of natural ability led to him falling to the ground, before stubbornly rising again for yet another game. Many of those who scoffed at Nixon were part of an exclusive club known as the Franklins. These were the campus elite, unburdened by the harsh financial situation many of their classmates had to endure. In response, Nixon helped organize a rival club known as the Orthogonians, an odd collection of students that even accepted African American members. In contrast to the Franklins, whose yearbook photo attire consisted of elegant tuxedos, the Orthogonians wore open collared shirts to cast themselves as the everyday working men, aligning perfectly with young Richard's self-conception. It was through the Orthogonians that Nixon was able to find a place in campus politics. He defended their interests and led a movement to permit dancing at the old-fashioned Quaker college, despite being no fan of it himself. When Nixon received a scholarship to Duke University Law School, that was his ticket out of poverty. The fruits of his labor, the result of hours and hours of hard, honest work. He had risen above the squalor of his youth, but he didn't revel in this accomplishment. Nixon arrived at law school with the same isolated focus, poring over his books and his studies as though in an active battle, where his position could be ripped away from him at any moment. No matter what Nixon achieved as a young man, it was never quite enough to satisfy him. He always strove for more. Nixon was a painfully awkward young man, a trait he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Nixon himself admitted he was an introvert in an extrovert profession. Though just as Nixon may have had a natural disadvantage in politics as he had in sports, he overcame it with grit and dedication. When in public, he never seemed at ease. His gestures, his mannerisms, so awkward and mechanical. Early in life, Nixon developed a conception of himself as a have-not, someone who had to get their hands dirty and fight for a piece of the pie, directly opposed to the haves, who didn't have much to strive for, and as Nixon would say, just sat on their fat butts. He never quite let go of this conception. No matter what heights he reached, he would always think of himself as the underdog. If good things come easy to someone, are they any less deserving of it? Is the merit of an accomplishment based on the accomplishment itself or the effort taken to achieve it? One could read Nixon's pattern of self-destructive tendencies, as seen most famously through Watergate, as a way in which to confirm his persecution, that they were really out to get him. What starts the process are the laughs and snubs and slights that you get when you are a kid. But if you are reasonably intelligent, and if your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you learn that you can change those attitudes by excellence, personal gut performance, while those who have everything are sitting on their fat butts. There is a shockingly honest admission in that statement. If you are reasonably intelligent, and if your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you can change those attitudes. In no other circumstance have I ever seen an American president so clearly lay out their own personal motivations as being driven by hate and resentment, as though all of Nixon's many remarkable accomplishments were just a response to feeling inadequate, to being derided in his youth by those around him. This self-conception Nixon had of being the underdog, of always being under scrutiny, was a very powerful thing. You see him work best in adversarial situations. The man himself will tell you that. Nixon projected his low sense of self-worth onto others, almost as a way to overcome it. If he could show others he was the great man he aspired to be, maybe he himself would believe it. In his farewell address to the White House staff, you can see Nixon himself reflect on this attitude with seemingly deep regret.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Nixon, in fact, had destroyed himself, had overcome insurmountable odds, had achieved everything he ever set out to do, all while living in fear and paranoia that the press, the elites, the liberals were out to get the poor grocer's boy from Whittier, a paranoia that ironically posed a greater threat to him than the institutions he so feared ever could. It's so easy to see Nixon at the end of his life as a remarkably brilliant man who let his own feelings of inadequacy and bitter resentment destroy him, though I would argue that it was those same feelings that drove him to achieve the heights that he did.
It is my sad duty to report to the people of the United States that Richard M. Nixon, who served as our 37th president, died this evening in New York City at 9:08 p.m. with his family at his side.
When Nixon died, his funeral was held there, at the little house that his father built, the grounds of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, built upon the same land that Frank Nixon made the mistake of buying. The former leader of the free world, buried there in that land that may have failed to grow lemons, but succeeded in growing a president of the United States.
Because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
On July 15, 1979, President Jimmy Carter delivered an address that would perfectly capture that moment in American history.
For millions of Americans, this may be the worst weekend they've ever faced for finding gasoline to give them the automobile freedom they take as their due.
The Crisis of Confidence speech is perhaps the most memorable moment of Jimmy Carter's short tenure as President of the United States. This 33-minute address is drastically different from anything else we had ever seen from a president up to that point. It is an honest, direct address to the American people that clearly lays out the profound issues the nation must overcome.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose.
In the midst of an energy crisis, the president sought to revive civic duty among a cynical public. Carter had lost the people, and this was a great opportunity to get them back on his side.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession.
Carter will tell you himself that he's not much of an orator. Many of his speeches had fallen short, emphasizing the wrong parts of a sentence, making awkward hand motions, and coming off as aloof. For this speech, however, Carter prepared tirelessly and honed his speaking patterns and hand motions in a clear and authoritative way. What became known as the Malaise speech was initially very well received by the American people, but Carter would squander this 2 days later when he called a cabinet meeting where he accused much of his cabinet of being disloyal. The entire cabinet then offered Carter the resignations to allow him to keep only the people he wanted without having to fire anyone. In the next few days, Carter would accept 5 resignations, over half of his original cabinet. Carter and his advisors thought this would be a good way to shake up the administration and give the Carter presidency the jolt that it needed to keep going. The public reaction to this negated any headway that Carter had made in the eyes of the public. It was reminiscent of something that Richard Nixon would do. This could have been a new start to the Carter administration, a chance for him to reintroduce himself to the American people, but instead it ended up being one of the worst decisions of his presidency.
I give you our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. Oh, come on! He's history's greatest monster!
But the address's biggest failure, ironically enough, is its honesty. Carter would lose his re-election bid the following year in a landslide to California Governor Ronald Reagan, his polar opposite. A former actor whose charisma and optimistic vision of America drew a clear contrast to Carter's brutal honesty. A dreary reality of limiting consumption versus an optimistic vision for America's future. This isn't a video all about the crisis of confidence speech, but I chose to lead with it as it provides excellent framing for understanding Carter's shortcomings as a politician. Crisis of confidence is not only the name of the speech, it's the defining term of Carter's time in office.
In the beginning, Jimmy Carter's campaign was a lonely one. But through the months, more and more people recognized him as a new leader, a man who will change the way this country is run, a competent man who can make our government open and efficient, but above all, an understanding man who can make ours a government of the people once again. Jimmy Carter, a leader for a change.
Elected in a backlash to the Watergate scandal, Jimmy Carter represented a true departure from Washington politics. The happy-go-lucky peanut farmer turned governor of Georgia came out of nowhere to win the nation's highest office at one of the most tumultuous moments in our history. A politician that's too honest sounds like an oxymoron, so I wanted to learn a little bit more about Carter's personal life and what led him to the presidency. I've been reading His Very Best, a biography of Jimmy Carter by Jonathan Alter. The title of the book is in reference to Carter's incredible work ethic and his impressive ability in multiple disciplines. Politician, nuclear engineer, farmer, businessman, author, and carpenter, just to name a few. As the 39th president approaches his 100th birthday, I've been thinking a lot about how different the world is today from the one that he knew as a boy. In a way, Jimmy Carter actually lived in 3 centuries. His boyhood without electricity and indoor plumbing shares more characteristics with life in the 19th century than the 20th. In his book, Hour Before Daylight, Memories from a Rural Boyhood, Jimmy Carter says that before the age of 14, his biggest ambition in life was to be helpful to his father, and that ambition to him was as grand as any other that he would hold throughout his life. This is a very wholesome statement, and I think it's a testament to Carter's humility that in a life full of great accomplishments, this is still something that he looks back on fondly.
All of us must learn to waste less energy. Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas. If we learn to live thriftily and remember the importance of helping our neighbors, then we can find ways to adjust.
Watergate and the Vietnam War broke the fundamental trust that Americans had in their president. So of course, the man that pardoned Nixon would go on to lose to the kind, honest, outsider politician. Jimmy Carter set an impossible standard for himself by promising not to tell a lie, a promise that for the most part he actually kept. Don't get me wrong, he was still a politician, so from time to time he would lie, but for the most part, he was actually honest to a fault. Carter spoke like an engineer and saw governing as an engineering problem. He felt that he could find the flaws in the American system, come up with a solution, present them to the public, and then we would all work together as a nation to bring them to life. His engineering background allowed Carter to reject rigid ideology and embrace a data-driven worldview. But engineers aren't natural leaders in the world of politics with its trade-offs and backslapping.
Let me quote a few of the typical comments that I wrote down. This from a Southern governor. Mr. President, you're not leading this nation. You're just managing the government.
Presidents typically issue a series of pardons as they're approaching the end of their term in office. This is done, of course, to avoid political consequences. On the last day of his presidency, Bill Clinton pardoned his brother Roger, who had been convicted of cocaine possession. While people still called out the obvious nepotism, it was Clinton's last day in office, so what does he care? Jimmy Carter, however, would handle pardons differently. On the campaign trail, Carter had promised to pardon Vietnam War draft dodgers. Though he had supported the war, the soon-to-be president recognized the importance of settling unresolved tensions so that the country could heal and move forward. To the dismay of his staff, Carter issued the unconditional pardons to draft dodgers on his first day in office. Carter would famously refuse to consider the political consequences of a decision, which, while noble, is just an impractical way to govern. Rosalind Carter was the first lady to have a real political partnership with the president. Jimmy would regularly get her opinion on decisions, and she even attended cabinet meetings. Rosalind actually had much better political instincts than her husband did, and the staff would often ask her to convey messages to him. Jimmy Carter's biggest flaw was his inherent inability to combine politics with policy. He may have had great, well-thought-out ideas, but he failed at building the political relationships necessary to bring those ideas to life. In his very best, Alter describes Jimmy Carter as the polar opposite of Bill Clinton, his nearest Democratic successor. Clinton was a once-in-a-generation kind of political talent whose lack of personal discipline would bring about one of the worst political scandals in the history of the presidency. Carter, however, was a man of great personal discipline who was reckless in the realm of politics. The biggest example of this can be found in his relationship with Congress. Carter was the first president since Dwight Eisenhower to not serve in Congress. Despite having been governor of a state, this made him a massive political outsider for the time. Carter had no patience for pleasantries or backslapping, which in the world of politics is a pretty fatal flaw. He would often make congressmen feel snubbed through short conversations that were all business. His fiscal conservatism also made him a huge opponent of unnecessary public works projects. This approach makes sense until you consider the political implications. Patronage and pork are useful tools in politics. Canceling projects in a congressman's district might make sense on paper until you remember you're going to need that congressman's vote later on. Decisions like this alienated Carter from his own party and put him even more at odds with Congress. The most frustrating thing about Carter is that he's virtuous, but his approach to power is just naive and fundamentally flawed. Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill was a Democrat, but he found Reagan more easy to deal with as a politician. And he can actually provide some valuable insight into Carter as a leader.
You mentioned Jimmy Carter. You wouldn't have had that kind of a conflict with him. You called him one of the smartest presidents we've ever had.
Well, Jimmy Carter was brilliant. There's no question about it. I've never met a man as equally brilliant. He operated with no 3x5 cars. If you were talking about the defense of the nation, if you were talking about the SAR talks or the SALT talks, if you were talking about the guided missiles, if you were talking about opposition in the defense world, he knew more about it than his Secretary of Defense. He was just absolutely brilliant. You're talking about humanitarianism, you're talking about domestic affairs, you're talking about the effects of Central America, you're talking about the Panama Canal. Any of those things that you're talking about, he was an absolute, complete expert with regards to the subject. Now, Jimmy Carter had problems. He had a bad staff, in my opinion, who came to Washington with a chip on their shoulder against the leadership of the Democratic Party and the institution as a whole. And secondly, he had too many balls in the air. He kept sending over too much legislation. Reagan, on the other hand, President Reagan, while I never agreed with his philosophy, he had a brilliant staff around him.
He also had the Iran hostage affair. I mean, did that color his memory for all of us?
Oh, there were two things went bad in the Carter administration. One was the price of oil went from about $14 a barrel to $44 a barrel, and it set off a world depression and it caused an energy problem. The second, of course, was the Iranian situation and the hostages.
Let's take a look at some of the key differences between Carter and his ideological predecessors. Franklin Roosevelt ushered in the New Deal era of Democratic politics, a tradition that his successors would carry on for decades. From Truman's Fair Deal to Kennedy's New Frontier and Johnson's Great Society, they all continued Roosevelt's legacy. Jimmy Carter would be the first Democrat to break away from this ideology. Carter was a reformer, but more akin to Theodore Roosevelt than FDR, believing in good, honest, and fair government. This departure from the more liberal side of the Democratic Party would result in a primary challenge from Senator Ted Kennedy. Kennedy was, of course, the heir to the political dynasty left behind by his older brothers, though the Chappaquiddick incident of July of 1969 had ruined his chances for the presidency. Carter was generally cold to politicians, but Kennedy felt he got the worst of it. In reality, the two men just never really liked each other. Kennedy claimed that the Malay speech was the deciding factor in him running for the presidency, but there's some evidence that he was planning a campaign even before that. The two disagreed over policies such as Ted Kennedy's signature issue, universal health care, but in reality, this campaign was more illustrative of North and South divides in the Democratic Party, divides that would ultimately result in a total realignment. Carter's time in office may have been short, but it was a sign of which direction the country was headed in. Like an engineer, Carter was often frustrated and confused when others couldn't see the empirical truth. It is fitting then that the man who replaced Carter was an actor, able to play a part and craft a story that would appeal to the general public. Here we have Carter's honesty versus Reagan's fantasy.
Next Tuesday is election day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls. You'll stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you will vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
Reagan capitalized on Carter's failures on the economy, the Iranian hostage crisis, and the general mood of the country. Jimmy Carter's story teaches us that you can't just be above politics. You have to know the system and how to make it work to your advantage. While President Carter certainly did have some impressive achievements as president, he just wasn't very well suited for the job. Perhaps he could have been a great cabinet secretary, where he wouldn't have to worry as much about backslapping in politics. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.
I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machine is broken, I am ready. Woodrow Wilson. Death, it comes for us all. The finality of life is part of what gives life meaning. In studying the presidency, I've read cradle-to-grave biographies of many great men, taken in entire lifetimes by simply turning a page. From youthful aspirations to the struggles and triumphs of adulthood, and finally, the quiet contemplation of old age, all heading for the same destination. You wouldn't be blamed for thinking about mortality. For all the stories and legend of the American presidency, these incredible lives often end without ceremony. This won't be a video covering the last words of every single American president, simply the ones that I thought would add an interesting story to the video. If there's any that you feel I should have included which I didn't, please let me know in the comment section down below. George Washington, the nation's first president, the father of our country, died a quite preventable death. One regular day in December of 1799, Washington worked on his farm through the cold, rainy weather and chose not to change out of his clothes immediately after. He woke up with a sore throat the next day, and it worsened until he eventually struggled to breathe. His longtime doctor came, though it would have been best if he hadn't. The doctor performed the barbaric practice of bloodletting, which drained a staggering 40% of the first president's blood. Consistent with Washington's strength and stature, his last words were simply, "'Tis well," written into his journal. John Adams, the nation's second president, has some of the most famous last words of any commander-in-chief. Him and third President Thomas Jefferson had been staunch political rivals who faced off electorally before reconnecting and becoming quite close in their old age. Adams died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. His last words spoke of his nemesis turned confidant. The exact wording is disputed, but it was something along the lines of "Thomas Jefferson survives." As I'm sure most of you already know, Jefferson himself had passed earlier that day. His last words are often recorded as the poetic phrase, "Is it the 4th?" pointing towards the significance of Jefferson dying on that day.
In reality, this was likely said by Jefferson a few hours prior to his death, still July 3rd, when in failing health, he woke up and asked if it was already the 4th. His more probable last words were, "No, doctor, nothing more," refusing any more medication. The website from Monticello writes about this, saying, "These are perhaps too prosaic to be memorable. Is it the 4th?" or "This is the 4th of July," have come to be accepted as Jefferson's last words because they contain what everyone wants to find in such deathbed scenes: deeper meaning. The story of two founding fathers which played such pivotal roles in the founding of this nation, leaving this earth on the nation's anniversary, is sure to offer whatever deeper meaning we might search for. Adams's son, John Quincy Adams, was the only president ever to be elected to the House of Representatives after leaving office, where he served another 17 years. In quite dramatic fashion, Adams got up to speak on the House floor, dissenting from many of his colleagues who supported a resolution honoring veterans of the Mexican-American War, before struggling back to his desk and ultimately falling onto another congressman. He suffered a massive stroke and would be dead just 2 days later at the age of 80. His last words were either, "This is the last of the earth, I am content," or "This is the last of the earth, but I am composed." A small change that makes all the difference. Adams's political rival and fellow President Andrew Jackson has surprisingly sweet last words. "I hope to meet each of you in heaven. Be good children, all of you, and strive to be ready when the change comes." James K. Polk's last words were also very sweet, being dedicated to his wife of 25 years. "I love you, Sarah. For all eternity, I love you." Polk was just 53 years old at the time of his death. Sarah, who was only 45, would wear black morning dress in public for the rest of her life. She lived another 42 years, the longest widowhood of any First Lady up to that point. Her lifetime captures a remarkable span of American history. Born on a Tennessee plantation in 1803, surrounded by wealth enabled by the horrors of slavery, serving as a talented political advisor throughout her husband's career, embracing manifest destiny and expanding the United States through the Mexican-American War, only to see the country ripped apart in a brutal civil war. Living through Union-occupied Nashville and much of the Gilded Age before finally passing in 1891 at the age of 87. Sarah Polk could have been hanging out with John Adams until she was 23 and still could have met 9-year-old FDR before her own death. James Buchanan, he kind of threw in the towel, man. It's sad. Buchanan was, of course, the last president prior to the Civil War. He was a doughface, which means he was a Northerner with Southern sympathies. The tensions that led to the Civil War had been brewing for decades, and the war is not entirely Buchanan's fault. But he made horrible decisions and did very little to prevent the war and the secession of the Southern states. In consequence, he's often remembered as one of, if not outright, the worst president in American history. Buchanan, for the rest of his life, would strongly defend his presidency and claim that history would vindicate him, though as he died, he was seemingly aware of the true way that he would be remembered. "I shall carry to my grave the consciousness that at least I meant well for my country. O Lord God, as thou wilt." The death of Abraham Lincoln is incredibly famous, probably tied for the most famous presidential death. But I don't see his last words mentioned very often. Maybe because they're just so mundane. While watching My American Cousin at Ford's Theater, the Lincolns had been close together in their seats, holding hands when Mary Todd told her husband, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you?" To which he replied with the last words that he would ever speak, "She won't think anything of it." Minutes later, John Wilkes Booth shot the president in the back of the head. The irony of Lincoln's last words is that they're fairly true. For as famous as the scene of Lincoln's assassination is, we rarely, if ever, mention that him and Mary Todd were showing PDA at the time by simply cuddling in their seats. Funny enough, I feel that this detail really humanizes Lincoln. This famous figure who's on our currency, whose life and death we've learned about our entire lives. When you find out an additional detail about his famous death, even something as small as him and his wife showing each other affection, as they would have throughout their married life, it reminds you that this was in fact a human being who lived and loved and held hands with his wife. The great Civil War general turned US President Ulysses S. Grant's last words were simply water, fitting given that he died from throat cancer. Rutherford Hayes added another sweet entry to the canon of presidential last words by saying, "I know I'm going where Lucy is," about his wife who had passed a few years earlier. Hayes is said to have carried a picture of Lucy with him wherever he traveled following her death. Grover Cleveland's last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right," which was not true. Grover Cleveland was a decent president and a terrible, terrible person. In December 1873, Cleveland met Maria Halpin, a 38-year-old woman and mother of 2 children. He invited her to dinner, to which she agreed, given that Cleveland was a well-known man of high social standing. This is a warning that the next section of the video will be covering sexual violence. If you would like to skip over it for any reason, there will be a time code displayed on screen now. My language here will be lightened for the sake of YouTube guidelines, but please do not take that as any sort of downplaying of Cleveland's actions. My sources are listed below, and I encourage you to take a look at them for yourself. Cleveland walked Mrs. Halpin home after dinner, where she alleged that Cleveland proceeded to get on top of her and assault her by use of force and violence and without my consent. Of the traumatic incident, Maria Halpin also added, "Up to that hour, my life was as pure and spotless as that of any lady in the city of Buffalo. There was not the slightest shadow of suspicion over me." She now thought of herself as a quote-unquote ruined woman, reminding us of the archaic and cruel societal attitudes of the time. He then threatened to ruin her if she reported him to the authorities. She later said, "He told me that he was determined to ruin me if it cost him $10,000, if he was hanged by the neck for it. I then and there told him that I never wanted to see him again and would never see him, and commanded him to leave my rooms, which he did." Cleveland was a well-respected former district attorney. He understood that men, especially of his social stature, were not likely to be prosecuted for sexual crimes. Even if she did choose to go to the authorities, Cleveland was also a former sheriff with inside connections all over the justice system. Halpin became pregnant as a result of Cleveland's assault and gave birth to a baby boy 9 months later, bearing Cleveland's last name. The future president proceeded to have the boy taken away from Halpin and had her placed in a mental asylum, though she was released after only a few days. During the 1894 presidential election, this incident would come to haunt Cleveland as his detractors chanted, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" in reference to Cleveland being an absentee father. Here, Cleveland painted Maria Halpin, who had been the striking image of a chaste widow, as a sexually promiscuous woman who could have been impregnated by any number of men. Even if you don't believe Halpin's story, which I personally do given the amount of evidence for it, Cleveland also has other questionable actions with women throughout his life. He had been a bachelor up to his presidency, and while in office, the 49-year-old Cleveland married the 21-year-old Frances Folsom, to whom Cleveland had served as an unofficial guardian since she was a young girl. While his assault of Maria Halpin might seem far removed from Cleveland's last words, the incident was the first thing that came to my mind when I read them. We, as human beings, look for meaning in someone's last words, a grand, profound statement about their life. But when a man of Grover Cleveland's character can lay on his deathbed and say, "I have tried so hard to do right," it shows you how unrelated the reality of someone's life can be compared to their perception of it. If these words had come from, say, George Washington, whose positive contribution to our country is infinitely more substantial and better remembered than Cleveland's, but who also had his own reprehensible actions, such as owning human beings, would we acknowledge the irony and hypocrisy in the same way? Theodore Roosevelt had lost his first wife during childbirth as a young man, and his mother would pass away that same day. He drew an X in his journal that night and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." He of course went on to live a remarkable life full of adventure, but seeing his despair in this difficult moment is quite striking. Roosevelt died in his sleep, so the last words he ever spoke were, "Please put out the light," which, while unrelated to his journal entry, is a fitting motif for the sentimental among us, such as myself. Roosevelt kept the light going in his life despite the hardship until the end. Calvin Coolidge, famously known as Silent Cal, was not a man of many words, but we do know the last words he ever spoke. He greeted a carpenter working outside his home with a simple, "Good morning, Robert," which I find to be an oddly beautiful send-off. Franklin Roosevelt led our country through some of its most tumultuous times, the greatest economic depression, and the most terrible war in human history. He was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms before dying during the 12th year of his historic presidency. For years, Roosevelt had hidden his paralysis from the American public, but at the end, his team had been hiding the dire picture of his health more broadly. It wasn't hard to tell that Roosevelt was tired and not too long for this earth. He died while sitting down for a portrait in his beloved Warm Springs, Georgia. This reference photo, taken shortly before his death, shows him as the picture of health. His last words were, "I have a terrific pain in my head," spoken just before he had a massive aneurysm. Tragically fitting last words for this giant of American history. Dwight Eisenhower had done so many remarkable things with his life that by the time the death came around, I think he was just ready to go. His last words were, "I want to go. God, take me." John F. Kennedy, given the sudden nature of his death, does not have very profound last words, but they are quite ironic. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie rode with the president and the First Lady in the motorcade that day in Dallas. Just moments before the bullets were fired, Nellie Connally told Kennedy, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome, Mr. President," to which he replied, "No, you certainly can't." For as fascinating as Lyndon Johnson is, his last words aren't particularly interesting. He cried out, "Send Mike immediately," Mike being a member of his Secret Service detail. By the time the agents reached the president, he had already died. Richard Nixon rose from poverty to the presidency through grit, self-discipline, and a fair bit of dirty politics. He left office disgraced, eventually going on an extensive rehabilitation tour where he gave excellent interviews and participated in world affairs as an elder statesman. He's exceptionally well-spoken, and he's one of my favorite presidents to sit down and listen to, but that doesn't mean that his last words are particularly eloquent. As he suffered from the massive stroke in his New Jersey home, he cried out help to the staff. I've often said that Nixon, for all of his character flaws and all of the policy disagreements that I have with him, to me is the most human of all the presidents. There's a heartbreaking video of Nixon at his wife Pat's funeral, only 10 months prior to his own death, where you can see him sobbing in grief. Rarely do you see such an outward display of emotion from a former leader of the free world. As of this recording, the last president to pass away was George H.W. Bush, whose last words are said to have been, "I love you too," said to his son and fellow president. Only the second father-son duo after John and John Quincy Adams. Your guys' support makes this show possible, and I appreciate every single one of you. I didn't write an outro for this video. I thought it would be fun to present my raw thoughts. I think I went into this project with the flawed expectation of the last words of these great men being these profound, eloquent sayings, but in reality, a lot of them are fairly disappointing. But I think that that's actually quite reassuring, is that no matter what we do in life, when it's time to go, we won't necessarily have something super flowery or well said to say. Sometimes you just don't know that it's coming. Sometimes you know that it's coming and you're ready. Sometimes you might just want to give your final goodbyes, but we're all heading for the same destination, and I guess we just have to make use of our time while we have it. Special thank you to Bobbletopia, Michael Lowe, John Reynolds, Luke Johns, Braden Selby, Simon Pusateri, Extra, Kenneth Choi, Crib Steck, Quack, and J Reaction. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.